Chapter 1. The World Before the Storm. The wind does not whisper in the north, it howls. It tears across the jagged cliffs and frozen seas, carving its voice into stone, into bone, into memory. Long before the world would come to fear the name Viking, before monasteries burned and kings trembled in their halls, there was only this, a brutal land at the edge of survival, where the sun itself seemed uncertain whether it wished to rise. This is where the story begins. In the far reaches of Scandinavia, across what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the earth was not generous. Winters stretched long and merciless, swallowing entire seasons in darkness. The soil was thin, stubborn, unwilling to yield. Crops failed as often as they survived. Hunger was not an event, it was a companion. And yet people endured. They built their homes from timber and sod, low and strong against the wind. Smoke curled endlessly from their roofs, carrying with it the scent of fire, meat, and survival. Inside, life was harsh but close. Families gathered around the hearth, their stories rising with the flames, stories of gods who ruled the skies and giants who lurked in the dark. Because in this land, the line between reality and myth was thin. The people of the North did not simply live in their world, they believed they shared it. They spoke of Odin, the All-Father, who sacrificed his own eye for wisdom and hung himself upon the great tree of existence to grasp the secrets of the universe. They spoke of Thor, whose hammer could shatter mountains and summon thunder itself. They whispered of Loki, the trickster, whose cunning could reshape fate. These were not distant deities, they were present, watching, judging. Every storm was a message, every victory a blessing, every death a passage into something greater or something far worse. This belief shaped everything. A man was not measured by comfort but by courage, by his willingness to face the unknown, to defy the cold, the sea, and the inevitable certainty of death, because death, to the people of the North, was not the end. It was an invitation. Those who died with honor, with weapon in hand, were said to be chosen by Odin himself, carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, a great hall where warriors would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnarok. There, they would stand beside the gods when the world itself met its end. It was a promise that made fear irrelevant. And in a land where survival demanded strength, that belief became power. But belief alone does not build a legend. It was the sea that would change everything. At first glance, the waters surrounding Scandinavia seemed as unforgiving as the land itself. Dark, cold, unpredictable. Waves crashed against the rocks with violent indifference. Storms rose without warning, swallowing ships whole and leaving nothing behind but silence. To most, it was a barrier. To the people of the North, it became a path. They learned to read its moods, to understand its rhythms. They built vessels unlike anything the world had seen before, long, narrow ships crafted with precision and purpose. Flexible yet strong, fast yet steady. These ships could cut through deep ocean waters or glide silently along shallow rivers. They were not just tools. They were extensions of the will to survive. At first, these journeys were not about conquest. They were about necessity. Fishing, trading, exploring, seeking resources where the land offered none. Each voyage carried risk but also possibility. And with each journey, something began to change. The horizon no longer represented the end of the world. It became a question. What lies beyond? That question would echo through generations. As populations slowly grew and resources remained scarce, pressure began to build. Families expanded, but land did not. Opportunities were limited. Power was fragmented among local chieftains, each ruling small territories, each vying for influence, for loyalty, for control. Conflict was inevitable. Raids between neighboring groups were not uncommon. Small skirmishes, quick strikes, battles for survival or revenge. These were not yet the legendary raids that would shake kingdoms, but they were the beginning of something darker, something more organized. Because in the north, strength was respected, but leadership was earned. A chieftain was not simply born into power, he had to prove it. Through battle, through success, through the ability to reward his followers. Loyalty was not given freely. It was bought with victory, with wealth, with honor. And wealth was limited. There were no vast gold reserves in the frozen soil, no overflowing granaries, no great cities filled with riches. But rumors began to travel. Whispers carried by traders, by travelers, by those who had ventured further than most. Stories of lands to the south and west. Lands where the soil was rich, where food was abundant, where monasteries stood filled with treasures. Gold, silver, sacred objects crafted with care and devotion. And most importantly, unprotected. These were not warriors who guarded such places. They were monks, men of prayer, men who believed their God would protect them. They had never faced the north. Back in Scandinavia, these stories took root. At first, they were just that, stories. But stories have power, especially in a world where survival depends on opportunity. The idea of wealth beyond imagination, of lands ripe for the taking, began to stir something deep within the hearts of the people. Desire, not just for survival, but for more. For glory. For legacy. Young men listened closely. They gathered in longhouses, hearing tales of distant shores, of easy riches. Their imaginations burned brighter than the hearth fires. They did not want to inherit the same struggles, the same endless fight against the land. They wanted something greater. And chieftains began to see the potential. A raid was not just about wealth. It was about power. A successful raid meant gold, yes, but it also meant reputation, influence, followers. It meant becoming more than just another leader struggling to maintain control. It meant becoming a legend. But legends are not born from desire alone. They are forged through action. And action requires risk. To leave the shores of Scandinavia was to step into the unknown. The sea did not forgive mistakes. Navigation was primitive, guided by the sun, the stars, and instinct. There were no guarantees of return. But that uncertainty was part of the appeal. Because in a culture that valued courage above all else, what could be more honorable than facing the unknown head-on? The preparation began slowly. Ships were built with greater care, designed not just for travel but for speed and stealth. Crews were selected, not only for strength but for loyalty. Weapons were sharpened, shields reinforced. Every detail mattered. This was not random violence. This was strategy. Timing would be crucial. Surprise even more so. The goal was not prolonged battle but swift, overwhelming force. Strike quickly, take what could be taken, and leave before resistance could form. It was a simple concept, but its impact would be anything but. As these plans took shape, something deeper stirred within the culture of the North. The idea of the warrior was evolving, no longer just a defender of land or family, but an aggressor, an explorer, a force that could shape the world beyond their shores. This shift was not sudden. It was gradual, almost invisible at first. But it was happening, and with it came a new kind of identity. The word Viking itself, in its earliest form, did not define a people. It defined an action. To go a Viking meant to embark on a raid, to seek fortune and fame across the sea. It was a choice, a dangerous one. But in a land where danger was constant, it felt almost natural. As the seasons passed, the preparations became more frequent, more refined. Small expeditions tested the waters both literally and figuratively. Some returned with stories of success. Others did not return at all. Each outcome carried a lesson, and each lesson brought them closer to something inevitable. The world beyond Scandinavia was vast, largely unaware of what was coming. Kingdoms were divided, focused on their own conflicts. Monasteries stood isolated along coastlines, their wealth visible, their defenses minimal. They were not prepared, not for what the North was becoming. Back in the longhouses, the atmosphere was changing. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something significant was approaching. The old ways of survival were no longer enough. The horizon called, louder than ever. Men gathered, not just as farmers or fishermen, but as warriors in waiting. They spoke of destiny, of fate. In Norse belief, fate was not something to be avoided. It was something to be met, embraced, even if it led to death, especially if it led to death because a glorious death was the ultimate victory. It ensured remembrance. And in a culture where stories were everything, to be remembered was to live forever. The skalds, the storytellers of the North, played their part. They crafted tales of bravery, of impossible feats, of men who faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. These stories were not just entertainment. They were fuel. They inspired. They challenged. They set the standard. To be ordinary was to be forgotten. To be extraordinary was to become immortal in the minds of those who came after. And so the stage was set. The land had hardened them. The sea had opened their path. The stories had ignited their ambition. The beliefs had erased their fear. All that remained was the moment. The moment when preparation would turn into action. When the first true raid would move from idea to reality. It would not be the largest, it would not be the most organized, but it would be the spark. A single event that would ripple across continents. A moment that would mark the beginning of an age defined by fire, steel, and fear. But for now, in this quiet before the storm, the North held its breath. The ships rested along the shores, their hulls reflecting the cold light of the sky. The warriors waited, their weapons ready, their minds focused not on what they might lose, but on what they could gain. The wind continued to howl, unchanged, unforgiving, as if it already knew what was coming. Because soon, that wind would carry more than just the sound of nature. It would carry the echoes of war cries, the clash of steel, the screams of those caught unprepared, and the name that would come to define an era. Vikings. They were not yet the terror of Europe, but they were becoming something unstoppable. And the world was about to find out. Chapter 2. The First Raid. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves. No thunder splits the sky. No great voice declares that the world is about to change. Instead, they arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, until the consequences begin to unfold. The first true Viking raid was one of those moments. It did not begin with an empire. It began with a ship. Cutting through cold, gray waters under a sky that offered no warmth, a single longship moved with purpose. Its hull rose and fell with the rhythm of the sea, its carved prow staring forward like a silent predator. The men aboard did not speak much. They did not need to. They all understood what this journey meant. This was not a voyage of trade. This was something else. The wind carried them westward, away from the familiar fjords and jagged coastlines of Scandinavia, into waters that felt different, heavier somehow, as if the sea itself sensed the shift. Behind them lay a life of struggle and scarcity. Ahead of them, possibility. And risk. The men aboard that ship were not kings. They were not yet legends. They were farmers, fishermen, sons of the North who had chosen to step beyond the limits of their world. Each of them carried something personal into that moment. Hunger, ambition, desperation, pride. Some sought wealth. Others sought something harder to define. A chance to prove themselves. Because in their world, a man's worth was not measured by what he had, but by what he dared to take. Days passed on the open water. The sea did not make it easy. Winds shifted without warning, waves rose like walls, and the cold seeped into every bone. There were no guarantees they would reach land, no certainty that they would return. But that uncertainty had already been accepted. In the north, fear was not something to eliminate. It was something to master. And so they pressed on. At last, a shape appeared on the horizon. Land. Low and dark against the distant sky, barely visible at first, then slowly taking form as the ship drew closer. There were no towering fortresses, no walls, no signs of armies waiting to defend it. Just coastline. Quiet. Unaware. The men adjusted their course, steering toward it with careful precision. They did not rush. Speed would come later. Now it was about control, about arriving unseen. As the ship approached the shore, the details became clearer. Green land, far richer than anything most of them had known. Soft compared to the harsh terrain they had left behind. And there, not far from the water's edge, stood something unusual. A structure, simple yet distinct, built with care, its shape unfamiliar to Viking eyes, a monastery. To the men aboard the ship, it looked almost fragile. They had heard the stories. Places like this were said to hold treasures beyond imagination. Gold, silver, sacred objects crafted by skilled hands. Wealth not hidden deep beneath the earth but displayed openly as if it needed no protection. It was difficult to believe. But now it stood before them. Real. The ship slowed as it reached the shallows. Oars dipped silently into the water, guiding it closer to land. The sound was soft, controlled, every movement deliberate. This was the final moment. There would be no turning back. The keel scraped against sand. For a brief second, everything was still. Then movement. The men leapt from the ship, boots hitting wet ground, weapons already in hand. Axes, swords, shields, tools of survival in their world now carried into another. They moved quickly. Not with chaos, but with purpose. The monastery lay ahead, its doors closed, its inhabitants unaware of what was approaching. Inside, monks went about their routines, their lives shaped by prayer and devotion. They had no reason to expect violence. Not here. Not like this. The Vikings closed the distance. There was no formal signal, no shouted command. The attack began in an instant. The doors were forced open with brutal efficiency. Wood splintered under the force, the sound echoing through the quiet halls. What followed was confusion, then terror. The monks had no weapons. No training for this kind of violence. They were men of faith, not fighters. Their world had rules, a sense of order that governed life and death. But the men who had entered their sanctuary did not follow those rules. To the Vikings, this was not sacrilege. It was opportunity. They moved through the monastery with speed and precision. Anything of value was taken. Chalices, ornaments, coins, relics. Items crafted with care, now stripped from their sacred context and reduced to something simpler. Wealth. Resistance was minimal, but where it appeared, it was crushed without hesitation. There was no time for negotiation, no room for mercy. Every second increased the risk of discovery, of retaliation. This was not a siege. It was a strike. And it had to be fast. The sounds of the raid spread beyond the monastery walls. Cries, crashes, the unmistakable noise of violence where there had once been peace. For those who heard it from afar, it must have felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. Because it was unlike anything they had known. Raids were not unheard of in the world, but this was different. The attackers had come from the sea, without warning, striking a place that had never been designed to withstand such an assault. It shattered assumptions. Within minutes, it was over. The Vikings retreated as quickly as they had arrived, carrying with them everything they could take. There was no attempt to hold the land, no desire to linger. That had never been the goal. They returned to their ship, moving with the same controlled urgency. The shoreline that had seemed so quiet before now carried a different weight. It had been changed. Irreversibly. The ship was pushed back into the water, oars cutting through the waves as they pulled away from the coast. Behind them, the monastery stood damaged, its silence broken, its sense of safety destroyed. Ahead of them, the open sea. And something else. Understanding. As the distance grew, the men aboard the ship began to process what had just happened. Not just the success of the raid, but its implications. It had worked. The stories had been true. The wealth was real, the defenses were weak, the risk manageable. For the first time, the idea of raiding was no longer theoretical. It was proven. And proof changes everything. The return journey carried a different energy. Where there had been tension before, now there was something closer to certainty, confidence even. They had crossed the unknown and come back with more than they had left with. Gold, silver, and something far more valuable. Knowledge. Back in Scandinavia, their arrival did not go unnoticed. Ships returning from long voyages always drew attention, but this was different. The cargo they carried, the stories they told, they spread quickly. Faster than the wind that had carried them across the sea. At first there was disbelief. Then curiosity. And finally interest. Chieftains listened carefully. Warriors leaned in. The idea that had once seemed distant, almost mythical, was now grounded in reality. The world beyond their shores was not just reachable. It was vulnerable. The implications were impossible to ignore. One successful raid could be dismissed as luck, but it could also be seen as a beginning. And in a culture that valued strength, opportunity, and bold action, the latter interpretation began to take hold. Plans started to form. Not in the open, not all at once, but quietly, steadily. More ships would be built. More men would be gathered. Routes would be discussed, refined, expanded. This was no longer an experiment. It was a strategy. But while the North began to awaken to this new possibility, the lands that had been targeted were only beginning to understand what had happened. News of the raid spread slowly at first, carried by survivors, by witnesses, by those who had seen the aftermath. It moved from village to village, from coast to inland, growing with each telling. The details varied, but the core remained the same. Attackers from the sea. Sudden, violent, unpredictable. They did not behave like known enemies. They did not follow the patterns of traditional warfare. There was no declaration, no negotiation, no warning. They simply appeared and struck. For many, it was difficult to comprehend. Who were these men? Where had they come from? And perhaps most unsettling of all, would they return? The uncertainty was as damaging as the raid itself. Fear began to settle along the coasts, a quiet tension that lingered even in the absence of immediate threat. Monasteries, once places of peace and isolation, now felt exposed. Vulnerable. The world had shifted, even if only slightly. But slight shifts can lead to massive change. Back in the North, that single raid had done more than bring back wealth. It had ignited something. Ambition, once cautious, now burned with clarity. The horizon was no longer a question. It was an answer. And the answer was simple. There was more out there. More to take. More to conquer. More to become. The men who had participated in that first raid would not yet be remembered as legends. Their names would not echo through history in the same way as those who came later. But their actions had opened a door that could not be closed. Because once the idea of expansion takes hold, once the belief that the world beyond your borders is not just accessible but exploitable becomes reality, it spreads. It grows, and it demands to be pursued. The North was changing, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. The ships would become more numerous, the raids more frequent, the targets more ambitious. What began as a single strike would evolve into something far greater. An age defined by movement, by violence, by exploration on a scale that would reshape entire regions. But all of that lay ahead. For now, there was only the memory of that first raid. A small group of men, a single ship, a quiet coastline, and a moment when the balance between worlds shifted just enough. Enough to begin, because history does not always begin with a roar. Sometimes, it begins with a single, silent arrival from the sea. Chapter 3. Fury of the Longships. Fear does not spread all at once. It seeps, quietly at first, like water slipping through cracks in stone, unnoticed until the damage is already done. After the first raid, the world did not immediately descend into chaos. Kingdoms did not collapse overnight. Armies did not mobilize in panic. But something had changed. Along the coasts of what we now know as England, whispers began to circulate. Stories carried by survivors, by travelers, by those who had seen the aftermath with their own eyes. They spoke of men who came from the sea, men who did not behave like any enemy they had known. Men who did not ask for land. Men who did not demand tribute. Men who simply took. At first, these accounts were dismissed by some. Exaggerations, misinterpretations. Fear tends to distort memory after all, but as time passed, more reports emerged, not identical but consistent enough to form a pattern. Ships, long, narrow, moving faster than expected, arriving without warning, leaving devastation behind, and always vanishing back into the sea. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Back in Scandinavia, those early successes had not been forgotten. They had been studied, refined. What began as a bold experiment was quickly evolving into something far more deliberate. The design of the longship itself became central to this transformation. These vessels were no longer just tools of travel or fishing. They were engineered for a specific purpose. Speed, surprise, control. Built with overlapping planks, flexible yet strong, the longships could withstand the harshest waters while remaining light enough to be dragged onto shore. Their shallow draft allowed them to navigate not just open seas, but rivers, deep into lands that had never expected an attack from water. This was not just mobility. It was advantage. And the men who sailed these ships understood it. Crews grew larger, more disciplined. Raids became coordinated efforts rather than isolated acts. Timing was no longer left to chance. Routes were chosen with care, targets selected based on opportunity and vulnerability. This was no longer desperation. This was strategy. The longship became more than a vessel. It became a symbol, a warning, because once it appeared on the horizon, it was already too late. The next waves of raids came not as a single strike, but as a series of calculated incursions. Coastal settlements were hit first. Small, isolated, easy to overwhelm. The pattern remained consistent. Arrive fast. Strike hard. Leave before resistance could form. But with each raid, something new was added. Confidence. The Vikings were learning not just about their targets, but about themselves. They understood now that their methods worked, that their enemies were unprepared, often incapable of responding effectively within the short window of an attack. And so they pushed further. Deeper. More daring. The sea, once a barrier, had become their greatest weapon. It allowed them to choose when and where to strike. It gave them control over the rhythm of conflict. While their targets remained bound to land, to roads, to predictable paths, the Vikings moved freely across the water, unpredictable and fast. This asymmetry was devastating. Coastal communities began to change their behavior. Watch posts were established. Lookouts scanned the horizon, searching for the first sign of approaching ships. But even with these precautions, the advantage remained with the attackers. Because the sea does not reveal its secrets easily. A longship could appear suddenly, emerging from fog or rounding a distant point of land before anyone had time to react. By the time the alarm was raised, the Vikings were already upon them. Panic became part of the pattern. People fled inland, abandoning homes, possessions, anything that could not be carried. Some attempted to hide, hopping to avoid detection. Others tried to resist, but resistance required organization and time. Both were often in short supply. The raids were not just about wealth anymore. They were about impact. Each successful attack reinforced the reputation of the Vikings, not just as raiders but as something more elusive, something harder to define. A force, unpredictable, relentless, and fear, once established, began to work in their favor. Because fear changes behavior. It slows decision-making. It creates hesitation. It fractures unity. Leaders who might have organized defenses found themselves reacting instead of planning. Resources were diverted, attention split, priorities confused. All of it played into the hands of the attackers. Back in Scandinavia, the culture continued to shift. Young men no longer saw raiding as a distant possibility. It was becoming a path, a way to gain status, wealth, and recognition. To join a crew was to step into something larger than oneself, to participate in actions that carried meaning beyond the immediate. The longship became a gateway. To glory, to danger, to legacy. And with each returning expedition, the stories grew. Not just of gold and silver, but of the raids themselves. The speed, the violence, the shock of it all. These stories were told and retold, shaped by memory and imagination, becoming part of the cultural fabric. The Skalds took these accounts and transformed them into something more. Narratives, legends in the making. They spoke of warriors who moved like storms, who struck without warning and disappeared before the world could respond. They described the sea not as an obstacle, but as an ally, carrying the will of the North to distant shores. These stories did not just reflect reality. They amplified it. And in doing so, they inspired others to follow. The scale of raids began to increase. Where once a single ship might have ventured out, now multiple vessels sailed together. Fleets, small at first, then growing. Coordination became more complex but also more effective. With greater numbers came greater capability. Larger targets became viable. Monasteries were still frequent targets, but they were no longer the only ones. Towns, trading centers, even early fortified locations began to feel the pressure. The Vikings were testing boundaries, probing defenses, learning what worked and what did not. Each success expanded those boundaries further. But this expansion did not go unnoticed. Leaders in the affected regions began to adapt, slowly at first. Fortifications were reinforced. Coastal defenses improved. Communication between settlements increased. The initial shock was giving way to a more organized response. But adaptation takes time. And the Vikings were not standing still. They continued to refine their approach, staying ahead of the changes, exploiting weaknesses as they appeared. Their strength lay not just in their tactics, but in their flexibility. They were not bound by rigid structures. They could change quickly, and that made them dangerous. very dangerous. The psychological impact of their raids began to extend far beyond the immediate areas of attack. Inland communities, far from the coast, began to hear the stories. The idea of an enemy that could appear without warning, strike, and vanish was unsettling in a way that traditional warfare was not. It challenged assumptions. It created uncertainty. And uncertainty breeds fear. The longship, once an unknown silhouette on the horizon, was becoming a symbol recognized across regions. Its presence signaled not just an attack, but a specific kind of attack. Vast, decisive, unforgiving. For the Vikings, this growing reputation was an asset, because by the time they arrived, the battle was already half won. Fear had prepared the ground. As the seasons turned and the cycles of raiding continued, the scale and ambition of these expeditions kept increasing. The sea routes expanded, reaching further along the coasts, exploring new territories, identifying new opportunities. What had begun as isolated strikes was evolving into something far more complex. A network of movement, a system of expansion, and at the center of it all, the longship. It was more than wood and sail, more than craftsmanship and design. It was the embodiment of a new way of interacting with the world, a way that prioritized speed over strength, surprise over confrontation, adaptability over tradition. It allowed the Vikings to operate on their own terms, to dictate the conditions of engagement. And in doing so, it reshaped the nature of conflict itself. But with growth comes consequence. The increasing frequency and scale of raids began to strain the balance. Resources taken from distant lands enriched the north, but they also attracted attention. Leaders who might have ignored a single raid could not ignore a pattern. Retaliation became a possibility. Coalitions, however fragile, began to form. The idea of a coordinated defense, once unnecessary, was now being considered. The Vikings were no longer an unknown threat. They were a known danger. And known dangers invite response. Yet even as this response began to take shape, the Vikings continued to push forward. Their momentum had not yet peaked. Their understanding of the world beyond their shores was still expanding. And with that understanding came ambition. Not just to raid, but to dominate. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Raiding brought wealth. But control brought something more. Stability, power, influence. The seeds of that shift were being planted during these early waves of expansion, not fully realized, not yet defined, but present. Waiting for the right moment. For now, the fury of the longships continued to define the age. Each voyage added to the growing body of knowledge, each raid refining the methods, each success reinforcing the belief that this path, this way of life, was not just viable. It was superior. The world beyond Scandinavia was no longer distant or unknown. It was accessible and increasingly vulnerable. As the longships cut through the waters, carrying their crews toward new targets, new opportunities, the transformation of the Vikings was accelerating. They were no longer just survivors of a harsh land. They were becoming something else. Something that moved with purpose. Something that adapted and evolved. Something that would leave a mark far beyond their shores. The wind still howled across the north, unchanged. But now it carried something new. Not just the sound of nature, but the echo of oars striking water in perfect rhythm. The quiet approach of ships that brought with them not just men, but a new kind of war. And the world was only beginning to understand what that meant. Chapter 4. Sons of Odin. Before they were feared, they were shaped. Not by kings, not by empires, but by belief. In the north, a warrior was not simply trained, he was forged. Every hardship, every storm, every empty winter night carved something deeper into him. Strength was not optional. It was expected. But strength alone was never enough. What truly defined the warriors of the North was something far more powerful. Faith. Not the quiet, reflective faith of distant lands, but something raw, something immediate, a belief system that did not comfort, it demanded. Because the gods of the North were not gentle. They did not promise peace. They promised struggle. And in that struggle, meaning. From childhood, boys in Scandinavia grew up surrounded by stories that blurred the line between myth and reality. These were not tales told simply to entertain. They were instruction, warnings, aspirations. Odin the All-Father was not just a ruler of gods. He was a seeker of knowledge, a god who sacrificed himself to gain wisdom. He hung upon the great tree, pierced and alone, to unlock the secrets of the runes. To the people of the North, this was not a distant legend. It was a lesson. Power required sacrifice. Understanding required pain. And those who sought greatness would have to endure both. Then there was Thor, the Thunderer, the Protector. Where Odin represented cunning and knowledge, Thor embodied raw strength. His hammer, Mjolnir, was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of order against chaos. Every strike of thunder across the sky was seen as proof that Thor still fought, still defended, still stood between the world of men and the forces that would destroy it. To invoke Thor was to call upon power. To carry his symbol was to declare strength. But perhaps the most unsettling figure among the gods was Loki. Not a god of war nor of wisdom, but of chaos. Unpredictable, dangerous, necessary. Loki reminded them that the world was not stable. That order could collapse. That fate could twist in ways no one could foresee. In a strange way, his presence made the belief system more complete. Because it acknowledged something uncomfortable. That control was an illusion. And in a world where nature itself could turn against you without warning, that idea resonated deeply. Together, these beliefs formed a worldview that was fundamentally different from that of their neighbors. Life was not about avoiding conflict. It was about facing it, embracing it. Because beyond life, there was something waiting. Valhalla, the great hall of the slain. To die in battle was not a tragedy. It was an honor. Those chosen by Odin would be carried by the Valkyries to a place where warriors feasted, fought, and prepared for the final battle of Ragnarok. It was not a peaceful afterlife. It was an eternal war. And that made it desirable, because it meant that even in death, a warrior's purpose continued. This belief had consequences. Profound ones. It changed how men approached danger. Where others might hesitate, fearing death, the warriors of the North saw opportunity, a chance to prove themselves worthy, a chance to be remembered, a chance to be chosen. This did not make them reckless. It made them fearless. And fearlessness, when combined with discipline and experience, is a dangerous thing. Training began early. Not in formal institutions, not under structured systems, but within the fabric of daily life. Boys learned to handle tools, then weapons. Axes, knives, later swords and spears. Skills were passed down through practice, through observation, through necessity. Hunting taught patience. Fishing taught endurance. Conflict taught survival. There were no clear lines between civilian and warrior. Every man was expected to be capable of fighting, because in the North, threats did not wait for you to be ready. You either adapted, or you did not survive. But among these warriors, there were some who stood apart. Men who did not just fight, but transformed in battle. They were known as berserkers. Their reputation was unlike anything else. Stories described them as entering a state beyond normal understanding, a frenzy where pain no longer mattered, where fear disappeared entirely, where the line between man and beast seemed to blur. Some claimed they wore the skins of animals, channeling the spirit of the bear or the wolf. Others believed their state was induced through ritual, through belief so intense that it altered their perception of reality. Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. On the battlefield, berserkers were terrifying. They did not fight with caution. They charged, relentless, unstoppable. Their presence alone could disrupt enemy formations, break morale, create chaos where there had been order. But they were not without risk. Such intensity came at a cost. Control was difficult to maintain. In the chaos of battle, the line between ally and enemy could blur. Berserkers were as dangerous to those around them as they were to those they faced. And yet they were valued. Because in a culture that revered strength, that admired those who could push beyond normal limits, the berserker represented the extreme, the embodiment of war itself. But not all warriors were berserkers. Most were something else entirely. Disciplined, coordinated, strategic. The image of the Viking as a wild, uncontrolled fighter is only part of the truth. Beneath the ferocity was structure. Raids required planning. Crews required leadership. Success depended not just on individual strength, but on collective action. Shield walls, coordinated strikes, clear hierarchies within crews, these were not the actions of disorganized fighters. They were the actions of men who understood warfare. And as their experience grew, so did their capability. Leaders emerged, not always through birthright but through action. A man who led a successful raid, who brought back wealth, who protected his crew, that man earned loyalty. And loyalty was everything. Because a leader without followers was nothing. And followers without trust would not risk their lives. This dynamic created a system where power was fluid, where reputation mattered more than title, where success reinforced authority and failure could destroy it. It was a system that rewarded competence and punished weakness. As raids became more frequent, the role of the warrior evolved further. No longer just defenders or opportunistic attackers, they were becoming professionals of conflict. Men who understood not just how to fight, but when. Timing, positioning, psychology. They learned to exploit fear, to use speed as a weapon, to strike where resistance would be weakest. The lessons of each raid were carried forward, refined, applied again. And always under the shadow of belief. Before battle, rituals were performed, offerings made, symbols worn not as superstition, but as connection, a way to align themselves with the forces they believed governed their world. To fight was not just a physical act. It was a spiritual one. Victory was not just skill. It was favor. And defeat was not just loss. It was judgment. This perspective added another layer to their actions. Every raid, every battle carried meaning beyond the immediate outcome. It was a test of strength, of worth, of alignment with the will of the gods. And in that framework, hesitation had no place. As the reputation of Viking warriors spread, so too did the stories of their behavior. Not just their skill in battle, but their mindset, their willingness to face death without retreat, their apparent lack of fear. To their enemies, it was unsettling, because it defied expectation. Most armies relied on morale, on the idea that fear could be used to break an opponent. But what happens when the opponent does not fear death in the same way? What happens when death is not an end, but a reward? It changes the equation. It forces a different kind of response. And in those early encounters, many were unprepared for that shift. But while the outside world began to recognize the threat, within Scandinavia, this identity continued to solidify. The warrior was no longer just one role among many. He was becoming central, a symbol of what it meant to be part of this emerging culture of expansion, a reflection of the values that define the North: strength, courage, loyalty, belief. And above all, action. Because in the end, it was not enough to believe. It was not enough to prepare. At some point, every warrior had to step onto the ship, to leave the safety of the familiar, to face the unknown, and to prove, not just to others, but to himself, that he was worthy of the stories he had grown up hearing, worthy of the gods he claimed to follow, worthy of the fate he sought. The longships waited along the shores, as they always had. But now they carried something more than men. They carried identity, purpose, and a growing certainty that what they were doing, what they were becoming, was not temporary. It was transformation. The sons of the North were becoming the sons of Odin, not by birth, but by choice. And with each passing season, that choice would echo further across the world. Because belief, when combined with action, does not remain contained. It spreads, it influences, it reshapes. And in the case of the Vikings, it would soon collide with powers far greater than anything they had faced before. But for now, they stood at the edge of that collision, prepared, unyielding, and driven by something that could not be easily understood or easily stopped. The storm was no longer forming. It had already begun. Chapter 5. Kings of the Sea. Power in the North did not come from crowns. It came from proof. Before the world would know their names, before their banners would cast shadows across distant shores, the leaders of the Viking Age were something far more uncertain, men standing on the edge of opportunity, where ambition could either elevate them into legend or swallow them entirely. There were no vast kingdoms in early Scandinavia, no unified rule, no single authority that commanded all. Instead, the land was divided, fractured into small territories ruled by chieftains whose power depended on one thing above all else: loyalty. And loyalty was never guaranteed. It had to be earned. A chieftain was expected to provide, not just protection but opportunity, wealth, success, the ability to reward those who followed him, because in a world where survival was already difficult, no man would risk his life for a leader who could not deliver results. This created a system, unlike the rigid hierarchies of other regions. Here, leadership was fluid. A man could rise quickly and fall just as fast. And as the raids began to prove successful, as ships returned not just with stories but with gold, silver, and goods from distant lands, something began to shift. Power was no longer tied only to land. It was tied to the sea. The chieftains who understood this adapted. At first, the raids had been small: a single ship, a handful of men, a quick strike. But as knowledge spread and confidence grew, so did ambition. And with ambition came the need for stronger leadership, coordination, planning, vision. Because raiding was no longer just about taking what was available. It was about choosing targets, maximizing reward, minimizing risk. The men who could do this effectively began to stand out, not just as warriors but as strategists, as leaders. They gathered crews not by force but by reputation. A successful raid was more than wealth, it was advertisement, proof that following this man would lead to opportunity, to gain, to status. And so crews grew larger. Ships multiplied. What had once been isolated ventures began to resemble something closer to organized expeditions. Fleets. And at the center of each fleet stood a leader who had earned his position through action. These were not kings in the traditional sense. Not yet. But they were becoming something close. Because as their influence expanded, so did their authority. A chieftain who could command multiple ships, who could organize large-scale raids, who could return consistently with wealth. That man held power that extended beyond his immediate territory. He became a figure others looked to, followed, respected, feared. But power once gained demands to be maintained. And in the Viking world, maintaining power required constant motion. Stillness was weakness. A leader who stopped producing results, who failed to deliver wealth or victory, would quickly find his position challenged. Loyalty would shift, crews would disperse, rivals would emerge. There was no room for complacency. This pressure drove innovation. Raids became more sophisticated. Intelligence began to matter. Information about targets, defenses, geography, all of it became valuable. Leaders who could gather and use this information effectively gained an edge. And edges in this world determined survival. The sea itself became a domain of competition. Not just between Vikings and their targets, but among the Vikings themselves. Leaders sought to outdo each other, to achieve greater success, to build larger reputations. Because reputation was currency. It determined who would follow you, who would fight for you, who would trust you with their lives. And in a culture built on stories, reputation could spread far beyond direct experience. A successful leader's name would travel, carried by those who had sailed with him, by those who had heard the tales, by those who sought to align themselves with strength. Some names began to stand out. Not yet legendary in the way they would later become, but already distinct. Men who seemed to understand something others did not, who saw beyond the immediate raid, beyond the next voyage, toward something larger. A pattern, a future. Because with each successful expedition, a question began to take shape. What if this was not just about raiding? What if the sea could offer more than temporary gain? What if it could offer control? The idea was not fully formed, but it was there. And the leaders who began to consider it found themselves thinking differently, not just about where to strike, but about where to return, where to establish presence, where to move beyond taking and begin holding. It was a subtle shift, but a significant one, because it marked the beginning of something new. The transition from raiders to rulers. At the same time, the structure within Viking crews became more defined. Roles were clearer, responsibilities distributed. Not everyone was simply a fighter. Some were navigators, skilled in reading the stars and the sea. Others specialized in shipbuilding, ensuring that the vessels themselves remained superior. And at the center of it all, the leader coordinated, directed, decided. The success of a voyage often came down to his judgment, when to attack, when to retreat, how to respond when things did not go as planned. Because not every raid was successful. There were failures. Ships lost to storms, crews overwhelmed by unexpected resistance, plans that fell apart under pressure. These moments tested leadership in a way success never could. And those who survived them, who learned, who adapted, became stronger, more capable, more dangerous. Back in Scandinavia, the impact of these expanding expeditions was becoming visible. Wealth flowed back into the north, changing the landscape of power. Chieftains who had once been equals now stood apart, their resources allowing them to build larger halls, to host greater feasts, to reward more followers. This created a feedback loop. Wealth brought followers. Followers enabled larger raids. Larger raids brought more wealth. And so power concentrated. Gradually, inevitably, the idea of kingship, once distant, began to take shape, not as a formal institution, but as a natural consequence of success. Some leaders simply became too powerful to be considered equal to others. They commanded too many men, controlled too many ships, influenced too many decisions. They were, in effect, kings, even if the title had not yet fully solidified. But with greater power came greater risk. Rivalries intensified. Competition turned into conflict. Leaders who sought dominance did not just look outward toward foreign lands. They also looked inward toward each other. Alliances formed and broke. Battles were fought not just for wealth but for supremacy. The North was not united. It was dynamic, unstable, and that instability fueled further expansion. Because for many leaders, the sea offered something the land could not: space, opportunity, a way to grow without immediately confronting rivals at home. And so the fleets continued to grow. The voyages became longer, the targets more ambitious, the leaders more confident. They were no longer testing the world. They were beginning to shape it. Along distant coasts, the presence of Viking ships was becoming more frequent. What had once been a rare event was now something that could happen at any time. The unpredictability remained, but the scale had increased. Multiple ships, coordinated attacks, clear leadership. It was no longer a question of if they would come, but when. And each time they did, they brought with them not just violence, but a demonstration of their growing capability. Because these were not random acts. They were expressions of power, of leadership, of a system that was evolving rapidly, driven by the ambition of those who stood at its center. The kings of the sea. They did not wear crowns of gold. They did not sit on thrones in grand palaces. Their authority was not granted by divine right or ancient lineage. It was earned through action, through success, through the ability to lead men into the unknown and bring them back with more than they had before. And as their influence expanded, so too did their vision. The sea was no longer just a path. It was a domain, one that could be navigated, controlled, dominated. A domain where traditional rules did not apply, where speed and surprise could overcome size and strength, where a determined leader, with the right crew and the right ships, could challenge forces far greater than himself. This realization would drive the next phase of the Viking Age. Because once leaders begin to think beyond immediate gain, once they begin to see the potential for lasting power, everything changes. Raids become campaigns, expeditions become invasions, and leaders become something more than chieftains. They become architects of expansion. But for now, the transformation was still in motion. The kings of the sea were rising, one voyage at a time, one victory building upon the last. Their names beginning to carry weight, their reputations extending beyond their homelands. They were no longer just participants in a growing phenomenon. They were shaping it, directing it, defining it. And the world beyond the North, still struggling to fully understand what it faced, would soon come to recognize these men not just as raiders, but as leaders of a force that was becoming impossible to ignore. Because when power finds its path, it does not remain contained. It expands, relentlessly, like the sea itself. Chapter 6. The Great Heathen Army. By the time the North decided to return, it no longer came in whispers. It came as a force. What had once been scattered raids, fast strikes along vulnerable coastlines, was now evolving into something far more deliberate. The lessons had been learned, the risks had been measured, the rewards had been proven. And now the scale was about to change. The lands of England had already felt the sting of Viking attacks, monasteries burned, coastal settlements looted. Fear had spread slowly at first, then deeply. But despite the growing awareness, the response remained fragmented. Because England itself was not a single kingdom. It was divided. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, each with its own ruler, each with its own priorities, each with its own conflicts. And in that division, there was weakness. The Vikings saw it, understood it, and decided to exploit it. But this time, they would not come as raiders. They would come as something else entirely. An army. Not a loose gathering of ships and crews, but a coordinated force with a shared objective. A campaign, not a strike. A presence, not a moment. The idea of such an army did not emerge overnight. It was the result of years of experience, of growing confidence among Viking leaders who had begun to realize that the lands they raided were not just rich. They were conquerable. And so alliances were formed. Leaders who might once have competed now saw the advantage of cooperation. By combining their forces, they could achieve something none of them could alone: greater numbers, greater strength, greater impact. The motivations varied. Some sought revenge. Others sought land. Many sought wealth on a scale that small raids could no longer provide. But together, they formed something unified: the Great Heathen Army. It was not called that by those who marched within it. It was named by those who feared it. To the people of England, this was not just another wave of attackers. This was something different, something organized, something sustained, something that did not intend to leave. The army arrived not as a sudden strike, but as a calculated landing. Ships carried warriors across the sea in numbers far greater than before. When they reached the shores of East Anglia, the impact was immediate, but not in the way many expected. Instead of immediate destruction, there was negotiation. A demand: horses, supplies, resources. The Vikings understood something important. Mobility on land would be just as critical as mobility at sea. With horses, they could move faster, strike deeper, respond more effectively. They were adapting, evolving their methods beyond what had defined them in earlier years. This was not the behavior of raiders. This was the behavior of an army preparing for a campaign. East Anglia, unprepared for such a force, complied. It was a decision driven by necessity, by the hope that cooperation might prevent destruction. But it also revealed something dangerous. The Vikings could exert pressure without immediate violence. They could control outcomes. And control was power. With resources secured, the army began its movement. North, toward Northumbria. At the time, Northumbria was already unstable. Internal conflict had weakened its leadership, divided its forces. Two rival claimants to the throne had been fighting for control, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. The Vikings did not create this weakness. They exploited it. When they entered Northumbria, they did so with precision. York, one of the most important cities in the region, became their target. It was not just a settlement. It was a center of power, of trade, of influence. To take York was to send a message. The attack was swift, decisive. The city fell, and with it, the balance of power in the region shifted. The rival kings of Northumbria, faced with a common threat, attempted to unite. But unity born out of desperation is fragile. Their combined forces moved to reclaim York, to push back the invaders. The battle that followed was brutal, fierce, but it ended in failure. Both kings were killed, and with their deaths, Northumbria effectively collapsed. The Vikings had not just raided a kingdom. They had broken it. This was new. This was something the people of England had never faced before. An enemy that did not just take wealth and leave, but stayed, and reshaped the land it touched. From Northumbria, the army moved again. South, toward Mercia. The pattern repeated, but with increasing intensity. The presence of the army forced decisions: fight and risk destruction, or negotiate and hope for survival. Some chose resistance. Others chose submission. Neither guaranteed safety. Because the Vikings were no longer operating under a single, simple objective. Their goals were expanding. Land, tribute, influence, all became part of the equation. Mercia struggled. Its leaders attempted to respond, to organize defenses, to push back against the advancing force. But the scale of the challenge was immense. The Vikings were not a static enemy. They moved, adapted, responded. They controlled the pace. And controlling the pace of war often determines its outcome. Meanwhile, the army itself continued to evolve. It was not a monolithic force, but a coalition. Different leaders, different groups, operating under a shared purpose but maintaining their own identities. This created both strength and complexity. Coordination required leadership, authority, respect, and those who could provide it rose to prominence. Among them were figures who would later become central to Viking legend. Leaders whose names would echo through time, not just for their actions, but for what they represented. The shift from raiders to conquerors. The army did not rely solely on brute force. It used strategy, psychology, timing. The reputation built through years of raids now worked in its favor. Towns and regions that had heard the stories, that had seen the destruction from afar, often hesitated before engaging. That hesitation created openings. Openings the Vikings were quick to exploit. But not all responses were passive. In Wessex, something different was happening. Unlike the other kingdoms, Wessex began to organize a more consistent resistance. Its leadership recognized the nature of the threat and responded with a level of coordination that others had lacked. Battles were fought. Some won, some lost. But the key difference was persistence. Wessex did not collapse. It adapted. And this adaptation would become crucial. Because for the first time, the great heathen army faced an opponent that could match its flexibility. That could respond not just to individual movements, but to the broader strategy. The conflict intensified. It was no longer a series of isolated events. It was a campaign, a prolonged struggle that would shape the future of the region. For the Vikings, the success of the army confirmed what had once only been a possibility. They could do more than raid. They could conquer. They could control. They could establish themselves in lands far from their origin. But success also brought new challenges. Holding territory is different from taking it. It requires structure, administration, stability, things that raiding alone does not demand. The Vikings began to face these challenges in real time, adapting as they went. Settlements were established. Control was asserted, but maintaining that control required continuous effort, continuous presence. And that presence changed everything. Because now, the Vikings were no longer just an external threat. They were part of the landscape, a force within the region, not just beyond it. For the people of England, this was a turning point. The realization that the enemy was not going away. That this was not a temporary crisis, but a transformation. And transformations demand response. Stronger alliances, better defenses, new strategies. The old ways of dealing with threats were no longer sufficient. The great heathen army had forced a change, a rethinking of what war looked like, of how it was fought, of what it meant to defend a kingdom. Back in Scandinavia, the impact of the army's campaign resonated deeply. News of its success spread, reinforcing the idea that expansion was not just possible, but viable on a large scale. More men were drawn to the cause. More leaders considered their own ambitions. The ripple effect continued. Because once a model proves successful, it is repeated, expanded, refined. And the great heathen army was proof. Proof that the Vikings could operate not just as raiders, but as a unified force capable of reshaping entire regions. It was a moment of transition, from movement to presence, from taking to holding, from chaos to something approaching control. But it was not the end of the story. Far from it. Because the forces it had unleashed, the changes it had triggered, would continue to evolve, to expand, to collide with new challenges and new powers. The storm had grown. What began as isolated strikes had become a sustained force. And the world, now fully aware of what it faced, was being forced to adapt or fall. The great heathen army had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 7. Ragnar Legend and Reality. Some names are remembered. Others are transformed. In the world of the Vikings, where stories carried as much weight as truth, where memory was shaped not by written record but by spoken word, there emerged figures who existed in two forms at once: the man and the legend. And no name embodies that divide more than Ragnar. To some he was a king, to others a raider, to many something more, a symbol of everything the Viking Age would come to represent. But the question has never been simple. Was Ragnar real? Or was he created, piece by piece, story by story, until the line between history and myth disappeared entirely? The answer lies somewhere in between. Because in the North, truth was not always recorded. It was told. And what is told changes. The earliest stories of Ragnar do not come from his own time. They were written down generations later, preserved in sagas that blended fact with imagination. These accounts describe a man of extraordinary ambition, a leader who did not simply follow the path of raiding, but expanded it. A man who dared to go further, strike harder, risk more. But to understand Ragnar, one must first understand the world that created him. By the time his name began to spread, the Viking Age was already in motion. Raids had proven successful. Longships had carried warriors to distant shores. Leaders had begun to rise, shaping the direction of this expansion. Ragnar, if he existed as a single individual, was one of those leaders. But he did not emerge in isolation. He was part of a pattern, a reflection of the changing nature of Viking ambition. The stories describe him as a man driven not just by wealth, but by something deeper: curiosity, desire for recognition, a need to push beyond limits. He was not content with small raids or predictable targets. He sought something greater. And that pursuit led him into lands that had not yet fully understood the threat. One of the most famous accounts tells of Ragnar's raid on Paris. At the time, Paris was not the vast city it would later become, but it was still a significant center of power. Protected, defended, part of a larger kingdom that was far more organized than the scattered targets of earlier raids. To attack it was bold. To succeed seemed unlikely. But the story says he did. With a fleet of ships, Ragnar sailed up the river, using the very advantage that had defined Viking success: mobility. The ability to move where others could not, to strike where defenses were not designed to hold. The attack was not just a demonstration of force. It was a statement. No place was beyond reach. The defenders, unprepared for such an approach, struggled to respond effectively. The Vikings moved with the same speed and precision that had defined their earlier raids, but now applied to a larger, more complex target. The result, according to the sagas, was victory. Paris was not destroyed completely, but it was forced into submission. Tribute was paid, wealth exchanged for survival. And Ragnar returned with more than treasure. He returned with reputation, a reputation that would grow with each telling. But here, the line between reality and legend begins to blur. Historical records from outside the Viking world do mention a raid on Paris during this period, led by a Viking leader. But whether that leader was Ragnar, as described in the sagas, is uncertain. Names change across languages, across translations, across time. What is clear is that such a raid did happen, and that it had a profound impact. It demonstrated that the Vikings were not limited to isolated, undefended targets. They could challenge established powers. They could reach deep into territories that had once seemed secure. And that realization changed everything. But Ragnar's story does not end with victory. Like many legends, it is defined as much by its ending as by its beginning. The sagas tell of his capture, of a failed campaign, of a king who underestimated his enemy, or perhaps overestimated his own power. According to the stories, Ragnar was captured by a ruler in England, a king determined to make an example of him. Instead of a warrior's death, he was given something else. Execution. Not on the battlefield, but in captivity. Thrown into a pit of snakes. It is a scene that has endured in storytelling, not because it can be proven, but because of what it represents. The fall of a great figure, the idea that even the most powerful can be brought low. But more importantly, what followed. Because Ragnar's death in the sagas was not an ending. It was a beginning. His sons, driven by vengeance, are said to have rallied forces, forming what would become known as the Great Heathen Army. Their campaign, according to these stories, was not just about conquest. It was about revenge, a response to the death of their father. This connection between Ragnar and the army that would go on to reshape England is one of the reasons his legend holds such power. It places him at the center of a larger narrative, a catalyst for events that extended far beyond his own life. But again, the certainty is not absolute. Historians debate these connections. The timelines, the names, the details, they do not always align perfectly. It is possible that Ragnar, as remembered, is not a single individual, but a composite, a merging of multiple leaders, multiple stories, combined into one, because that is how oral traditions often work. They simplify, they condense, they create figures that embody larger truths. And Ragnar, whether as a man or a legend, embodies something essential about the Viking Age. The willingness to push beyond known limits, the ambition to challenge established powers, the acceptance that risk and reward are inseparable. Even his death, as described, reflects the values of his culture. The idea that a warrior's end is not defined by comfort, but by defiance, that even in defeat, there is a way to maintain honor. In some versions of the story, Ragnar faces his death without fear. He speaks of Valhalla, of joining the gods, of the inevitability of fate. It is less about the specifics and more about the message, that a true warrior does not fear the end. He meets it on his own terms as much as possible. And that message resonated. It spread. Because stories like this are not just about individuals. They are about identity. Ragnar became a figure through which the values of the Viking world could be expressed. Courage, ambition, defiance, the pursuit of something greater than survival. He became a symbol. And symbols have power. They inspire. They unify. They provide a narrative that people can attach themselves to. For the Vikings, as their world expanded, as their actions began to shape regions far beyond their homeland, such symbols became increasingly important. They helped define who they were, what they stood for, what they believed they were capable of. Ragnar, in this sense, was more than a man. He was an idea. an idea that could be carried forward, adapted, reinterpreted, an idea that could survive even if the details of his life remained uncertain. Meanwhile, outside the Viking world, his name, whether accurately recorded or altered through translation, contributed to the growing perception of the Vikings as something larger than life. Not just raiders, not just warriors, but figures of almost mythic presence. Unpredictable, relentless, driven by forces that others struggled to understand. This perception, whether entirely accurate or not, had real consequences. It influenced how enemies responded, how leaders prepared, how fear spread. Because when an enemy is seen as larger than life, it becomes harder to face them as simply human. And that in itself is an advantage. As the Viking Age continued to unfold, the stories of Ragnar and others like him would continue to evolve. New details added, old ones reshaped, the narrative expanding alongside the reality it reflected. But at its core, the story remained anchored in something real. A period of transformation. A shift from isolation to expansion. From survival to ambition. Ragnar stands at that intersection. Whether as a single man or a collective memory, he represents the moment when the Viking world began to fully realize its potential, to look beyond its own shores and see not just opportunity but destiny. And once that realization takes hold, it does not fade. It grows. It spreads. It reshapes everything it touches. The legend of Ragnar is not just about the past. It is about the forces that drove the Viking Age forward. Forces that would continue to collide with kingdoms, reshape cultures, and leave marks that would endure long after the stories themselves had changed. Because in the end, it is not always the details that matter most. It is the impact. And the impact of Ragnar, real or imagined, was undeniable. He did not just exist in history. He became part of what made it. Chapter 8. Conquest and Settlement. Raiding changes a world. Settlement transforms it. For years, the Vikings had come and gone like a storm. Sudden, violent, unpredictable, they struck, took what they could carry, and vanished back into the sea before any lasting response could take shape. But storms, no matter how destructive, eventually pass. What followed next did not. Because at some point the question shifted. Why leave? It was a simple thought, but its implications were enormous. The lands the Vikings had been raiding were not just rich, they were fertile, stable, structured in ways that Scandinavia was not. Where the North struggled against harsh winters and limited soil, these regions offered something different. Consistency, opportunity, a future that did not rely solely on risk. For generations raised in a world of scarcity, this was more than tempting. It was transformative. And so, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, the Vikings began to stay. Not as invaders passing through, but as settlers. The transition was not immediate. It did not happen in a single moment or through a single decision. It unfolded gradually, shaped by necessity, by ambition, and by the realities of sustaining power. Because holding land requires more than strength. It requires structure. In England, the impact of this shift became most visible in the regions that had already felt the force of the great heathen army. Areas that had once been contested, raided, destabilized, now began to change in a different way. Viking groups established control. Not temporary dominance, but something more permanent. They built, reinforced, organized. The land that came to be known as the Danelaw emerged from this process, a region where Viking influence was not just present, but dominant, where laws, customs, and governance reflected the traditions of the North rather than those of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This was not simply occupation. It was integration. And integration is far more complex than conquest, because ruling land requires dealing with people. Local populations did not disappear. They remained, living alongside the new arrivals, adapting in ways that were sometimes cooperative, sometimes resistant, often a mix of both. Conflict did not vanish, but it changed. Where once the interaction had been brief and violent, now it became continuous, daily, negotiated, structured. The Vikings, who had mastered the art of rapid attack, now had to learn something different. Administration, justice, balance. They had to decide how to govern, how to maintain order, how to ensure that their control remained stable. This required more than weapons. It required systems. And those systems began to form. Local leaders emerged, sometimes Viking, sometimes native, sometimes a combination of both through alliance or necessity. Laws were adapted, blending traditions. Disputes were settled not just through force, but through agreed processes. This was a new phase, not defined solely by violence, but by adaptation. The Vikings were no longer just outsiders. They were becoming part of the land. But this integration was not limited to England. Across the North Atlantic, similar patterns began to appear. Exploration, which had once served the purpose of raiding, now opened pathways for settlement. Islands that had been uninhabited or sparsely populated became destinations. The Faroe Islands, Iceland, places that offered space, isolation, and opportunity for those willing to take the risk. These were not easy lands. Harsh climates, limited resources, environments that demanded resilience. But for the Vikings, this was familiar territory. They understood hardship. They knew how to survive in difficult conditions. And more importantly, these lands were theirs. There were no established kingdoms to challenge their presence, no existing systems to disrupt. They could build from the ground up, shaping society according to their own traditions. Iceland, in particular, became a significant example of this process. Settled by groups seeking not just land but independence, it developed a unique structure. Without a central king, governance was based on assemblies, agreements, and shared responsibility. The Althing, a gathering of leaders, became a place where laws were made and disputes resolved. It was not chaos. It was order of a different kind, an order that reflected the values of the people who created it. Freedom balanced with responsibility. Power balanced with consensus. It showed that the Vikings were capable of more than war. They could build societies, sustain them, evolve them. Back in England, the presence of Viking settlers continued to reshape the landscape. Towns grew, trade expanded. Cultural exchange, whether intentional or not, began to influence both sides. Language shifted. Customs blended. Names changed. The impact was subtle at first, but over time it became undeniable. The Vikings were leaving a mark that would not fade with their departure, because they were not departing. They were staying. But this process was not without tension. The kingdoms that had once been targets of raids were now facing something more complex, an internal presence that challenged their authority, regions that operated under different rules, different loyalties. The response varied. Some sought to reclaim lost territory through force. Others negotiated. All were forced to adapt. Because the reality was clear. The Vikings were no longer just a threat from the outside. They were part of the internal structure, a force that had to be accounted for in every decision. This created a new kind of conflict. Not just battles for survival, but struggles for control, for influence, for identity. What did it mean to rule a land where cultures were merging, where traditions overlapped, where the line between invader and resident had begun to blur. There were no easy answers, and so the situation remained dynamic, fluid, changing. Some Viking leaders embraced this new role fully, transitioning from raiders to rulers. They established authority, built networks, maintained stability. Others struggled, finding that the skills required to take land were not always the same as those needed to hold it. Success depended on adaptability, on the ability to shift perspective, to see beyond immediate gain and consider long-term impact. And those who could do this thrived. Meanwhile, the concept of identity continued to evolve. The term Viking, once tied closely to the act of raiding, began to lose some of its original meaning. Those who settled, who farmed, who governed, were no longer defined solely by their role as raiders. They became something else. Communities, families, residents of lands far from their origin. But the legacy of their past remained. It shaped how they were perceived, how they were treated, how they understood themselves. Because even as they built new lives, the memory of how they had arrived could not be erased. It lingered in stories, in attitudes, in the structure of the societies they were helping to create. Trade became an increasingly important part of this new phase. With settlements established, the Vikings were no longer dependent solely on what they could take by force. They could produce, exchange, participate in broader networks of commerce. Goods moved across regions. Ideas moved with them. Connections formed. The world was becoming more interconnected. And the Vikings were at the center of that movement. Not just as raiders, but as participants, contributors, influencers. Their ships, once instruments of attack, now carried settlers, traders, explorers. The same technology that had enabled rapid expansion through violence now supported expansion through presence, through permanence. But even as settlement took root, the old ways did not disappear entirely. Raiding continued. Conflict remained. The warrior culture that had driven the initial expansion still existed, still influenced behavior, still shaped decisions. The Vikings were not abandoning their identity. They were expanding it, adding new layers, new possibilities. The balance between these roles was not always stable. Tensions existed between those who favored continued expansion through force and those who saw the value in stability, in building, in maintaining what had been gained. This tension would play a role in the events that followed. Because as the Viking world became more complex, so too did the challenges it faced. External resistance grew stronger. Internal divisions became more pronounced. The simple clarity of raiding, take and leave, had been replaced by something far more intricate. And intricate systems are harder to control, but they are also more powerful because they endure. The shift from conquest to settlement marked a turning point in the Viking Age. It signaled that this was not just a period of temporary disruption, but a lasting transformation of landscapes, of cultures, of identities. The Vikings were no longer just passing through history. They were embedding themselves within it, becoming part of the structure that would define regions for generations to come. And once embedded, they could not simply be removed. Their influence would persist, in ways both visible and subtle, in the shape of towns, in the flow of trade, in the language spoken by those who would never know the full story of how it all began. Because the greatest impact of the Vikings was not just what they destroyed. It was what they built, and what they became. The storm had not ended. It had settled, and in settling, it changed the world in ways that would never fully be undone. Chapter 9. Paris under siege. Cities believe in walls. They rise from stone and timber, layer upon layer, built not just to house people, but to keep danger out. Walls create the illusion of control. They define a boundary between order and chaos, between safety and threat. And for a long time, that illusion held. But the Vikings did not fight the way walls expected. They did not always attack where defenses were strongest. They did not always approach from land, where gates and fortifications could be reinforced. They came from the one direction most cities underestimated: the rivers. And in the heart of the Frankish kingdom, one city stood as both a symbol and a target: Paris. By the time the Vikings turned their attention toward it again, the city had already heard the stories. Tales of raids along distant coasts, of monasteries burned, of settlements overwhelmed before help could arrive. But Paris was not a remote village or an isolated monastery. It was important, strategic, defended, and that made it a challenge worth taking. The year was deep into the Viking Age, a time when their ambitions had grown beyond simple raids. The leaders of these expeditions were no longer content with quick strikes and immediate withdrawal. They sought something greater: recognition, dominance, proof that even the most significant centers of power were not beyond their reach. The river that led to Paris, the Seine, became the pathway, a lifeline for trade and movement, and now an entry point for invasion. Longships moved along its waters, not as isolated vessels, but as a fleet. Their presence transformed the river from a route of connection into a corridor of threat. Villages along the banks felt it first. The sudden appearance of ships, the swift strikes, the disappearance before organized resistance could respond. But this time, the movement did not stop. It continued. Up the river, toward the city itself. Paris, positioned on an island within the Seine, had natural advantages. Bridges connected it to the surrounding land, and fortifications provided a level of protection that smaller settlements lacked. Its defenders were not unprepared. But they were about to face something they had not fully encountered before: a sustained siege. When the Viking fleet arrived, it did not strike and leave. It surrounded, positioned, waited. This was not a raid. It was a test of endurance, of strategy, of will. The defenders of Paris, led by figures determined to hold the city, understood the stakes. This was not just about protecting wealth or territory. It was about preserving a symbol. If Paris fell easily, it would send a message far beyond its walls: that no city was safe, that no defense was sufficient. And so they prepared to resist. The Vikings, on the other hand, adapted their approach. The speed and surprise that had defined their earlier successes were no longer enough. A fortified city required something different: patience, pressure, persistence. They attacked the bridges, recognizing their importance. Control the bridges and you control movement. Cut them off and the city becomes isolated. The fighting was intense, concentrated, brutal. Defenders held their ground, repelling attempts to break through. But the Vikings did not rely on a single tactic. They probed for weaknesses, tested defenses, applied pressure from multiple angles. Time became a weapon. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The siege stretched on, and with it, the conditions inside the city began to change. Supplies dwindled. Morale was tested. The constant presence of the enemy just beyond the walls created a psychological strain that was as powerful as any physical attack. Outside the walls, the Vikings maintained their position. This was not the environment they had mastered. Not entirely. They were warriors of movement, of rapid engagement, of controlled chaos. A siege required them to remain in place, to sustain their own resources, to maintain discipline over a longer period. And yet they adapted. They built camps, organized supply, maintained pressure. The same flexibility that had defined their raids now allowed them to function in a different mode of warfare. The defenders of Paris were not passive. They fought back. Sorties were launched, attempts made to disrupt Viking positions to weaken their hold. Each engagement carried risk. Each success, however small, mattered. Because in a siege, momentum is fragile. It can shift. And when it does, the consequences are immediate. The river itself became a contested space. Control of movement along the Seine was critical for both sides. Reinforcements, supplies, communication, all depended on it. The Vikings sought to dominate it. The defenders sought to maintain access. The struggle extended beyond the walls, beyond the immediate battlefield. It became a broader contest of control. As the siege continued, the reality of the situation became clear to both sides. For the Vikings, the city was not easily taken by force alone. Its defenses held. Its defenders remained committed. The cost of a direct assault would be high and success uncertain. For the defenders, the pressure was relentless. Time worked against them as much as it worked against their enemies. Holding out required endurance, coordination, and the hope that relief would come. And relief was coming. The Frankish king, responsible for the broader region, could not ignore the situation. The siege of Paris was not just a local crisis. It was a direct challenge to authority, to stability, to the perception of control. An army was gathered. A response prepared. But responses take time. And in that time, the Vikings continued their campaign. They expanded their presence beyond the immediate siege, raiding surrounding areas, maintaining pressure not just on the city, but on the region as a whole. This served multiple purposes. It weakened potential support. It gathered resources. And it reinforced their reputation. They were not contained. They were everywhere. The arrival of the Frankish forces changed the dynamic. It introduced a new variable, a direct confrontation. But even here, the outcome was not simple. The Vikings, faced with the possibility of a larger engagement, did not necessarily seek a decisive battle. Their strength lay in control of conditions, in choosing when and where to engage. And sometimes, the most effective move is not to fight. Negotiation entered the picture, not as a sign of weakness, but as a strategic choice. The Frankish king, recognizing the difficulty of dislodging the Vikings through force alone and the risk of prolonged conflict, made a decision. Payment, tribute, silver in exchange for withdrawal. It was not the first time such a decision had been made. But in this context, it carried weight, because it acknowledged something: that the Vikings were not just a threat to be repelled. They were a force to be managed, to be bargained with. The agreement was reached. The Vikings lifted the siege. They moved on, but not empty-handed. They left with wealth, with proof, with a demonstration of their capability. Paris had not fallen, but it had not truly won either. It had survived. And survival in this context came at a cost. The impact of the siege extended far beyond the immediate outcome. It reinforced the reality that even major cities, even fortified centers of power, were vulnerable to Viking tactics. Not necessarily to destruction, but to pressure, to disruption, to the kind of sustained challenge that could force difficult decisions. For the Vikings, the siege represented something important: growth. They had shown that they could operate beyond quick raids, that they could engage in prolonged campaigns, that they could challenge significant targets and extract value without necessarily destroying them. This expanded their options, their strategies, their vision. Back in the north, stories of the siege spread, not just of battle but of outcome, of a city that had resisted but still paid, of a campaign that had not ended in conquest but in success. Because success in this context was not defined solely by taking land. It was defined by achieving objectives. And the objective had been met. The legacy of the Siege of Paris is not just in what happened, but in what it revealed. It showed that the Viking Age had reached a new level of complexity. A phase where warfare was not just about force, but about strategy, about negotiation, about understanding the balance between risk and reward. It showed that the Vikings were not limited to a single way of operating. They could adapt, shift, evolve, and that adaptability made them one of the most formidable forces of their time. For the people of Europe, the lesson was equally clear. The threat was not temporary. It was not isolated. It was persistent. And it required more than walls to withstand. Because walls can delay. They can resist. But against an enemy that can change its approach, that can choose its method, that can apply pressure in ways that are not always direct, walls alone are not enough. The Siege of Paris did not end the Viking threat. It refined it. It demonstrated its potential. And it set the stage for what would come next. Because each encounter, each conflict, each moment of adaptation pushed both sides further, toward a future where the lines between raider and ruler, attacker and negotiator, would continue to blur. And in that blurred space, the true impact of the Viking Age would take shape. Chapter 10. The Eastern Path. Not all Vikings sailed west. While the coasts of England and the rivers of Francia burned with the fury of longships, another movement was unfolding, quieter, less dramatic in appearance, but no less significant in its impact. It moved east, away from the storm-swept Atlantic and into a world of vast rivers, dense forests, and distant empires. A world that did not fear the Vikings in the same way, not yet. Because here, the Vikings would not just raid. They would connect. The geography of the eastern lands was different. Instead of open seas and exposed coastlines, there were rivers, long, winding arteries that cut deep into the heart of continents. The Dnieper, the Volga, routes that linked the Baltic Sea to regions far beyond, to lands rich in resources, culture, and opportunity. To most, these rivers were boundaries. To the Vikings, they became roads. The longship, already a masterpiece of design, proved adaptable once again. Its shallow draft allowed it to navigate these waterways with ease. Where the rivers became too narrow or shallow, the ships could be carried over land, dragged from one waterway to another. It was not easy. It required strength, coordination, endurance. But it was possible. And possibility was enough. The men who traveled these routes were different in focus from those who raided the West. They were still warriors, still capable of violence, but their objectives were broader. Trade, connection, exploration. They came to be known as the Rus. Whether that name originated from them or was given by those they encountered, it came to define a presence that would shape the Eastern world in profound ways. As they moved along the rivers, they encountered new peoples. Slavic tribes, communities with their own structures, their own conflicts, their own opportunities. The interactions varied. Sometimes trade, sometimes alliance, sometimes conflict. But over time, patterns began to form. The Vikings did not simply pass through these regions. They established footholds, settlements along key points of the river routes, places where goods could be exchanged, where influence could be maintained, where control over movement could be asserted. These were not the same as the settlements in England or Iceland. They were more strategic, positioned not just for living, but for controlling flow. Because in the East, wealth did not only come from what you could take. It came from what you could move. Furs from the forests, silver from distant lands, slaves captured in conflict, goods flowing between regions that had previously been only loosely connected. The Vikings inserted themselves into this network, and then they began to shape it. Cities began to emerge, not massive at first, but significant. Centers of activity, of exchange, of power. Places like Novgorod and later Kiev became focal points, not just for Viking activity, but for the blending of cultures, the merging of traditions, the creation of something new. The Rus were not simply imposing themselves. They were integrating, adapting to the environment, to the people, to the opportunities that existed. This required a different kind of leadership, less focused on immediate conquest, more focused on long-term stability, on maintaining relationships, on ensuring that the flow of goods, of wealth, of influence continued. But the Eastern path did not end with rivers and forests. It extended further, toward an empire unlike anything the Vikings had encountered before. Constantinople, a city that stood at the crossroads of continents, a center of wealth, culture, and power that dwarfed anything in the north or west. Its walls were legendary, its defenses sophisticated, its influence vast. To approach such a city was to confront something fundamentally different. This was not a vulnerable monastery or a divided kingdom. This was a structured, resilient empire. And yet the Vikings came, at first as traders. Their goods, their skills, their presence became known within the Byzantine world. The empire, always pragmatic, recognized value where it existed. These northern warriors, with their reputation for strength and their willingness to travel vast distances, represented an opportunity, not just as traders, but as soldiers. Thus emerged one of the most fascinating transformations of the Viking identity. The Varangian Guard, elite warriors drawn from the north who served as personal protectors of the Byzantine emperor. Their loyalty was not tied to local politics or shifting alliances within the empire. They were outsiders, bound by oath, by payment, by honor. And they were trusted. In a world where trust was often fragile, that alone made them valuable. For the Vikings who joined the Varangian Guard, this was a different path. Not raiding, not settling, but serving. Fighting in battles far from their homeland, within a system that was far more structured than anything they had known. They adapted to new forms of warfare, new hierarchies, new expectations. And in doing so, they gained something. Experience, wealth, perspective. They saw a world that was more complex, more organized, more interconnected than the one they had left behind. They witnessed systems of governance, of defense, of culture that operated on a scale far beyond the scattered chieftaincies of Scandinavia. And when they returned, if they returned, they carried that knowledge with them. The Eastern path was not defined by a single type of interaction. It was a network. Trade routes connecting distant regions. Settlements anchoring presence. Service within foreign empires. Conflict where necessary. Adaptation at every step. It showed that the Vikings were not limited to one identity. They could be raiders, settlers, traders, mercenaries. They could shift depending on context, depending on opportunity. And that flexibility made them uniquely effective. But this expansion also had consequences. As the Rus established themselves, they began to form their own structures of power. Leadership became more centralized in certain areas. Control over key routes translated into authority over surrounding regions. The foundations of future states were being laid. Not intentionally, perhaps, but inevitably, because sustained presence leads to structure, and structure leads to governance. The blending of Viking and local cultures created something new. Languages influenced each other, customs merged, identities evolved. The distinction between Viking and local became less clear over time. Integration replaced separation, and with integration came permanence. The impact of the Eastern expansion was not as immediately visible as the dramatic raids in the West. There were no burning monasteries, no sudden collapses of kingdoms, but its influence was deep, lasting. It reshaped trade networks, connected regions, contributed to the formation of new political entities. It extended the reach of the Viking world far beyond what might have been expected from a people often defined by their violence. Because the Eastern Path revealed something essential, that the Vikings were not just destroyers. They were connectors, bridging worlds that had previously been distant, creating links that would endure long after the age of raids had passed. Back in Scandinavia, the knowledge of these Eastern ventures added another layer to the evolving identity of the people. The horizon was no longer just westward. It was everywhere. Opportunities existed in multiple directions. Paths diverged, choices expanded, and with each path taken, the Viking world became more complex, more interconnected, more influential. The longships that once carried warriors to raid distant shores now carried traders along rivers, explorers into unknown territories, mercenaries into the service of emperors. The same tools, different purposes, the same people, evolving roles. The Eastern Path did not replace the Western expansion. It complemented it, balanced it, added depth to a story that might otherwise have been defined solely by conflict. Because history is rarely one-dimensional, and the Vikings, often remembered for their fury, were equally defined by their adaptability, their ability to see opportunity where others saw obstacles, to move where others could not, to become what the moment required. And in the East, that ability allowed them to do something remarkable, not just to leave an impact, but to become part of a world far larger than their own, a world that would in turn shape them, in ways that would echo long after the longships had faded from the rivers, long after the raids had ended, long after the name Viking had begun to change. Because the Eastern Path was not just a journey, it was a transformation, one that proved that the reach of the North was not limited by geography, only by imagination, and their imagination had no boundaries. Chapter 10. The Eastern Path. Not all Vikings sailed west. While the coasts of England and the rivers of Francia burned with the fury of longships, another movement was unfolding, quieter, less dramatic in appearance, but no less significant in its impact. It moved east, away from the storm-swept Atlantic and into a world of vast rivers, dense forests, and distant empires. A world that did not fear the Vikings in the same way, not yet. Because here, the Vikings would not just raid. They would connect. The geography of the eastern lands was different. Instead of open seas and exposed coastlines, there were rivers, long, winding arteries that cut deep into the heart of continents. The Dnieper, the Volga, routes that linked the Baltic Sea to regions far beyond, to lands rich in resources, culture, and opportunity. To most, these rivers were boundaries. To the Vikings, they became roads. The longship, already a masterpiece of design, proved adaptable once again. Its shallow draft allowed it to navigate these waterways with ease. Where the rivers became too narrow or shallow, the ships could be carried over land, dragged from one waterway to another. It was not easy. It required strength, coordination, endurance. But it was possible. And possibility was enough. The men who traveled these routes were different in focus from those who raided the West. They were still warriors, still capable of violence, but their objectives were broader. Trade, connection, exploration. They came to be known as the Rus. Whether that name originated from them or was given by those they encountered, it came to define a presence that would shape the Eastern world in profound ways. As they moved along the rivers, they encountered new peoples. Slavic tribes, communities with their own structures, their own conflicts, their own opportunities. The interactions varied. Sometimes trade, sometimes alliance, sometimes conflict. But over time, patterns began to form. The Vikings did not simply pass through these regions. They established footholds, settlements along key points of the river routes, places where goods could be exchanged, where influence could be maintained, where control over movement could be asserted. These were not the same as the settlements in England or Iceland. They were more strategic, positioned not just for living, but for controlling flow. Because in the East, wealth did not only come from what you could take. It came from what you could move. Furs from the forests, silver from distant lands, slaves captured in conflict, goods flowing between regions that had previously been only loosely connected. The Vikings inserted themselves into this network, and then they began to shape it. Cities began to emerge, not massive at first, but significant. Centers of activity, of exchange, of power. Places like Novgorod and later Kiev became focal points, not just for Viking activity, but for the blending of cultures, the merging of traditions, the creation of something new. The Rus were not simply imposing themselves. They were integrating, adapting to the environment, to the people, to the opportunities that existed. This required a different kind of leadership, less focused on immediate conquest, more focused on long-term stability, on maintaining relationships, on ensuring that the flow of goods, of wealth, of influence continued. But the Eastern path did not end with rivers and forests. It extended further, toward an empire unlike anything the Vikings had encountered before. Constantinople, a city that stood at the crossroads of continents, a center of wealth, culture, and power that dwarfed anything in the north or west. Its walls were legendary, its defenses sophisticated, its influence vast. To approach such a city was to confront something fundamentally different. This was not a vulnerable monastery or a divided kingdom. This was a structured, resilient empire. And yet the Vikings came, at first as traders. Their goods, their skills, their presence became known within the Byzantine world. The empire, always pragmatic, recognized value where it existed. These northern warriors, with their reputation for strength and their willingness to travel vast distances, represented an opportunity, not just as traders, but as soldiers. Thus emerged one of the most fascinating transformations of the Viking identity. The Varangian Guard, elite warriors drawn from the north who served as personal protectors of the Byzantine emperor. Their loyalty was not tied to local politics or shifting alliances within the empire. They were outsiders, bound by oath, by payment, by honor. And they were trusted. In a world where trust was often fragile, that alone made them valuable. For the Vikings who joined the Varangian Guard, this was a different path. Not raiding, not settling, but serving. fighting in battles far from their homeland, within a system that was far more structured than anything they had known. They adapted to new forms of warfare, new hierarchies, new expectations. And in doing so, they gained something: experience, wealth, perspective. They saw a world that was more complex, more organized, more interconnected than the one they had left behind. They witnessed systems of governance, of defense, of culture that operated on a scale far beyond the scattered chieftaincies of Scandinavia. And when they returned, if they returned, they carried that knowledge with them. The Eastern Path was not defined by a single type of interaction. It was a network: trade routes connecting distant regions, settlements anchoring presence, service within foreign empires, conflict where necessary, adaptation at every step. It showed that the Vikings were not limited to one identity. They could be raiders, settlers, traders, mercenaries. They could shift depending on context, depending on opportunity. And that flexibility made them uniquely effective. But this expansion also had consequences. As the Rus established themselves, they began to form their own structures of power. Leadership became more centralized in certain areas. Control over key routes translated into authority over surrounding regions. The foundations of future states were being laid. Not intentionally, perhaps, but inevitably, because sustained presence leads to structure, and structure leads to governance. The blending of Viking and local cultures created something new. Languages influenced each other, customs merged, identities evolved. The distinction between Viking and local became less clear over time. Integration replaced separation, and with integration came permanence. The impact of the Eastern expansion was not as immediately visible as the dramatic raids in the West. There were no burning monasteries, no sudden collapses of kingdoms, but its influence was deep, lasting. It reshaped trade networks, connected regions, contributed to the formation of new political entities. It extended the reach of the Viking world far beyond what might have been expected from a people often defined by their violence. Because the Eastern Path revealed something essential: that the Vikings were not just destroyers. They were connectors, bridging worlds that had previously been distant, creating links that would endure long after the age of raids had passed. Back in Scandinavia, the knowledge of these Eastern ventures added another layer to the evolving identity of the people. The horizon was no longer just westward. It was everywhere. Opportunities existed in multiple directions. Paths diverged, choices expanded, and with each path taken, the Viking world became more complex, more interconnected, more influential. The longships that once carried warriors to raid distant shores now carried traders along rivers, explorers into unknown territories, mercenaries into the service of emperors. The same tools, different purposes, the same people, evolving roles. The Eastern Path did not replace the Western expansion. It complemented it, balanced it, added depth to a story that might otherwise have been defined solely by conflict. Because history is rarely one-dimensional, and the Vikings, often remembered for their fury, were equally defined by their adaptability, their ability to see opportunity where others saw obstacles, to move where others could not, to become what the moment required. And in the East, that ability allowed them to do something remarkable. Not just to leave an impact, but to become part of a world far larger than their own. A world that would, in turn, shape them, in ways that would echo long after the longships had faded from the rivers, long after the raids had ended. long after the name Viking had begun to change, because the Eastern Path was not just a journey, it was a transformation, one that proved that the reach of the North was not limited by geography, only by imagination, and their imagination had no boundaries. Chapter 11. Viking Life Beyond War. War made them feared, but it did not define their entire existence. To understand the Vikings only as raiders is to see only the storm and miss the world that existed when the skies were clear. Because between the voyages, between the battles, between the moments that history chose to remember, there was something else. Life. Structured. Demanding. Surprisingly complex. Back in Scandinavia, far from the clash of steel and the burning of distant shores, the rhythm of existence followed a different pattern. It was not driven by conquest, but by survival. The land still dictated terms. The seasons still controlled everything. Winter did not negotiate. It arrived, heavy and silent, covering the world in cold and darkness. During these months, activity slowed. Travel became dangerous. The sea, once a pathway, turned hostile, and so communities turned inward. Homes became centers of life. The longhouse, a structure built from timber, earth, and effort, was more than shelter. It was a shared space where families lived together, where warmth was maintained, where stories were told. Fire burned at its center, not just for heat, but as a focal point for everything that mattered. Around that fire, knowledge was passed down. Not through books, through memory, through voice. The skalds, the storytellers, played a vital role. They preserved history, or at least a version of it. They spoke of gods, of heroes, of journeys across seas and battles fought under distant skies. But they also spoke of everyday things, of family, of honor, of what it meant to live well. Because life in the North required more than strength. It required understanding. Spring, when it came, brought change. The ice receded, the land softened, activity resumed, farming became central, fields were prepared, planted, tended. Crops like barley and rye were essential, providing the foundation for survival through the next winter. This was not easy work. The soil was still unforgiving in many places. Success depended on timing, on effort, on a level of resilience that mirrored what was required in battle. But this work mattered, because without it, nothing else was possible. Fishing supplemented the diet, especially in coastal regions. The sea, while dangerous, was also a source of life. Knowledge of its patterns, its rhythms, its behavior was passed down through generations. Every catch mattered. Every failure had consequences. Animals were raised not just for food but for materials, wool for clothing, hides for tools, bones for crafting. Nothing was wasted. Efficiency was not a choice, it was a necessity. And within this system, roles were defined. Men often took on tasks that required physical strength, that involved travel, that carried risk. But this did not mean that women were secondary. Far from it. Women held significant responsibility within Viking society. They managed households, oversaw resources, ensured that daily life functioned. In many cases, they controlled the keys to storage, symbolizing authority over the domestic sphere. But their influence extended beyond that. In the absence of men, whether due to travel or conflict, women took on leadership roles. They made decisions, managed property, maintained stability. Their position was not passive. It was active, essential. This balance of roles created a system where survival depended on cooperation. Each contribution mattered. Each role carried weight. Children were raised within this environment, learning through observation, through participation. There was no clear separation between education and life. Skills were acquired by doing, by watching, by being part of the system from an early age. By the time they reached adulthood, they were not just prepared. They were necessary. Craftsmanship played a crucial role in this world. Tools, weapons, clothing, ships, all required skill to create. Blacksmiths, for example, held an important position. The ability to shape metal to create strong and reliable tools and weapons was invaluable. Woodworkers, too, were essential. The longship, often seen as a symbol of Viking power, did not build itself. It required precision, knowledge, and experience. Each plank, each joint, each detail mattered. A poorly built ship could mean death at sea. A well-built one could change the course of a life. Art existed as well. Not in the grand, monumental sense seen in other cultures, but in detail. Intricate carvings, patterns woven into clothing, designs etched into objects. These were expressions of identity, of creativity, of a desire to shape the world beyond pure function. Even in a harsh environment, there was room for beauty. Trade connected the Viking world to others. Goods moved across regions, carried by ships that served not just as instruments of war, but of exchange. Silver, furs, tools, crafted items, all part of a network that extended far beyond Scandinavia. Markets formed. Interactions increased. The world became larger. And with that expansion came influence. Ideas traveled alongside goods. Techniques, beliefs, customs, all moved across boundaries, shaping societies in subtle ways. The Vikings were not isolated. They were part of a broader system. Religion remained central to life. The gods were not distant concepts, but active presences. Rituals were performed, offerings made, symbols worn, not as routine, but as necessity. A way to maintain balance, to seek favor, to understand the forces that shaped their existence. Important moments, births, marriages, deaths were marked with ceremony. These events were not just personal. They were communal, shared, meaningful. Death, in particular, carried significance. Burial practices varied, but often reflected status. Some were laid to rest in graves with goods that might be needed in the afterlife. Others, more prominent, were given ship burials, sent into the next world with the same vessels that had defined their lives. These practices were not just about honoring the dead. They were about reinforcing belief. The idea that life continued, that actions mattered, that identity did not end with death. Law and order existed, though not in the centralized form seen in larger kingdoms. Assemblies were held where disputes were resolved, decisions made, agreements formed. These gatherings were important. They provided structure, a way to manage conflict without constant violence. Because even in a culture that valued strength, uncontrolled conflict was not sustainable. Balance had to be maintained. Honor played a critical role in this system. Reputation was not just about status, but about trust. A man or woman known for fairness, for reliability, for strength of character, held value within the community. Conversely, those who broke trust, who acted dishonorably, faced consequences. Social, sometimes physical. Because in a system without strong central authority, enforcement relied on collective agreement, on shared values. And those values were deeply embedded. As the Viking world expanded, as settlements formed in distant lands, these aspects of daily life traveled with them. They adapted to new environments, to new challenges, but the core remained. Community, responsibility, balance between survival and ambition. The image of the Viking as a constant warrior, always in motion, always in conflict, fades when viewed against this broader context, because most of life was not spent in battle. It was spent building, maintaining, living. The raids, the wars, the expansion, they were moments. Important ones. defining ones, but they existed within a larger framework, a society that functioned, that endured, that created continuity across generations. And it is this continuity that allowed the Viking Age to sustain itself. Without the structure of daily life, without the systems that supported existence, the raids would have been isolated events, unsustainable in the long term. But they were not isolated. They were connected to a foundation built not on conquest, but on survival, on adaptation, on the ability to create a life in one of the harshest environments imaginable, and then carry that life beyond it. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, storytellers, leaders, families, and in that complexity lies their true identity. Because it is easy to remember the moments of violence, the battles, the raids, the fear, but it is harder and more important to understand the world that made those moments possible. A world where every day mattered, where every action contributed to survival, where life in all its forms continued, regardless of what happened beyond the horizon. And it was from that world that everything else emerged. Chapter 12. God's Fate in Ragnarok. Before they sailed, before they fought, before they chose to risk everything for glory or survival, they believed, not in a distant, silent force that watched from afar, but in a universe alive with presence. A world where gods walked unseen, where fate moved like an invisible thread through every life, where the end of everything was not feared, but expected. To understand the Vikings is to understand this belief, because it shaped everything. The Norse cosmos was not simple. It was vast, layered, held together by a structure that existed both in story and in meaning. At its center stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree, not just a symbol but a framework of existence itself. Its roots and branches connected different realms, each with its own nature, its own purpose. Asgard, the realm of the gods; Midgard, the world of humans; Jotunheim, the land of giants; and others, each contributing to a system that was dynamic, unstable, always in motion. This was not a perfect universe. It was a contested one. Order existed, but it was constantly challenged by chaos. The gods did not rule uncontested. They fought, struggled, resisted forces that sought to undo everything. And that struggle defined existence. Odin, the All-Father, stood at the center of this system, not as an unquestioned ruler, but as a seeker, a god who pursued knowledge at any cost. He sacrificed his eye for wisdom, hung himself upon Yggdrasil to gain the power of the runes, sought insight into the future even when that future held destruction. Because Odin knew something. He knew that the end was coming. Ragnarok. Not a possibility. A certainty. This idea alone sets Norse belief apart. Most systems promise continuation, stability, a future that can be secured through right action. But in the Norse worldview, even the gods are not eternal. Even they will fall. Ragnarok is the final battle. A moment when the forces of order and chaos collide, when the gods face their enemies in a confrontation that will destroy the world as it exists. Fire will consume the land, the sea will rise, the sky itself will break, and the gods will die. Odin will fall. Thor will fall. The world will end. But this ending is not meaningless. It is not a failure. It is part of the design. Because after destruction comes renewal. A new world rising from the ashes. Different. Changed. But continuing. This cycle of destruction and rebirth shaped how the Vikings saw everything. Life was not about avoiding the end. It was about facing it with strength, with dignity, with courage, because the end could not be stopped, only met. This belief removed a certain kind of fear. Not fear of pain or of loss, but fear of inevitability. When you accept that even the gods will die, that the world itself will end, the question changes. It is no longer, how do I survive forever? It becomes, how do I live now? And the answer in Viking culture was clear. With honor, with action, with a willingness to face whatever comes. The concept of fate or weird was central to this worldview. Fate was not something to be controlled. It was woven, predetermined in ways that could not be fully understood. The Norns, beings associated with destiny, were said to shape the course of lives, to determine outcomes beyond human influence. But this did not lead to passivity. It led to intensity. Because if fate cannot be changed, then what matters is how you meet it. Do you face it with courage? Or do you retreat? This perspective created a culture where actions carried weight beyond immediate consequences. A brave act, even if it led to death, was meaningful. A cowardly act, even if it preserved life, was not. Reputation extended beyond the present. It reached into memory, into legacy, into the stories that would be told after death. Because while life might end, the story could continue. And in a world where stories were everything, that mattered. Thor, the Defender, represented another aspect of this belief. His battles against the giants were not just physical confrontations, but symbolic ones. Order against chaos, stability against destruction. Each storm, each strike of thunder was seen as part of this ongoing struggle. To invoke Thor was to align oneself with that resistance, to stand against forces that threatened to overwhelm. Loki, as always, complicated the picture. A figure of chaos, of unpredictability, of change. His actions often led to disruption, to conflict, to consequences that could not be easily controlled. And yet, he was part of the system. Necessary. Because without chaos, there is no balance. Without disruption, there is no change. Loki's role in the events leading to Ragnarok highlights this complexity. He is both part of the world and a force that contributes to its end. Not purely evil, not purely good, but something else entirely. A reminder that the universe is not simple, that it cannot be reduced to clear categories. This complexity extended into rituals and daily practices. Offerings were made to the gods. Blots, ceremonies involving sacrifice, were performed to seek favor, to maintain balance, to ensure that the relationship between humans and the divine remained intact. These were not symbolic acts. They were functional, a way to influence outcomes, even within a system governed by fate. Because while fate determined the broad strokes, the details could still be shaped. At least that was the belief. Seers or Verlvas held a unique position within this system. They were believed to have insight into the unseen, the ability to interpret signs, to understand aspects of fate that were hidden from others. Their words carried weight, guided decisions, influenced actions, but even they did not claim complete control. Only glimpses, fragments of understanding. And sometimes those glimpses were enough. Death within this framework was not uniform. Not everyone went to the same place. Warriors who died in battle might be taken to Valhalla or to Folkvanger, another realm associated with the goddess Freyja. There, they would prepare for Ragnarok, training, fighting, waiting for the moment when they would be called upon. Others might go to Hell, a different realm, not necessarily a place of punishment, but of existence beyond life. The afterlife was varied, complex, reflective of the diversity of life itself. But regardless of destination, the transition from life to death was significant, marked Respected, because it was not an end. It was a continuation. In a different form, these beliefs influenced behavior in ways that extended beyond the battlefield. They shaped decisions, relationships, priorities. The idea that actions would be remembered, that they would contribute to a larger narrative, encouraged a focus on legacy, on what would remain after death. This did not always lead to noble behavior. Ambition could be driven by desire for recognition, for power, for status. But even that ambition was framed within the larger context of meaning, of purpose. The gods themselves were not perfect. They made mistakes, faced consequences, struggled, and in that they reflected the human experience. They were not distant ideals. They were participants in the same kind of world. A world where strength mattered, but so did wisdom. Where victory was possible, but never guaranteed. Where the end was certain, but the journey still mattered. As the Viking Age progressed, these beliefs traveled with the people. Into England, into the eastern lands, into every place where Vikings settled, traded, fought. But they did not remain unchanged. They interacted with other belief systems. With Christianity in particular. A faith that offered different answers, different structures, different promises. The interaction between these systems would eventually lead to transformation, to change. But at this stage, the Norse worldview remained strong, central, defining. It provided a framework through which everything else could be understood. The raids, the settlements, the decisions, the risks, all of it made sense within this context. Because when you believe that the world will end in fire and battle, when you believe that even the gods will fall, when you believe that fate is set, but honor is chosen, you approach life differently. You act, you risk, you push forward, not because you expect to avoid the end, but because you intend to meet it. On your terms. And in that intention lies the essence of the Viking spirit. Not just the willingness to fight, but the willingness to exist fully within a world that offers no guarantees. A world where meaning is not given, but created. Through action, through belief, through the stories that survive long after the final battle has been fought. Because Ragnarok, in the end, is not just a story about destruction. It is a story about acceptance, about courage, about facing the inevitable without retreat. And that idea shaped everything. Chapter 13. The beginning of the end. No age lasts forever. Not the rise of kingdoms. Not the fury of armies. Not even the momentum of something as relentless as the Viking expansion. For generations, the Vikings had pushed outward, driven by necessity, ambition, and belief. They had struck distant shores, carved out settlements, built networks of trade, and inserted themselves into the structure of regions far beyond their origin. They had adapted, evolved, expanded. But every system, no matter how effective, eventually meets resistance. And resistance changes everything. The beginning of the end of the Viking Age was not a single event. It was a convergence, a slow, unavoidable shift in conditions that had once favored expansion, now turning against it. At first, the signs were subtle. In England, the kingdoms that had once been divided, vulnerable to the tactics of the great heathen army, began to change. Leaders learned from past failures. They adapted their strategies. They strengthened their defenses. Most importantly, they unified. Where once Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex had operated independently, often in conflict with each other, the pressure of Viking presence forced a reconsideration. Survival required coordination. It required leadership that could see beyond immediate concerns. In Wessex, that leadership emerged. Not perfect, not without struggle, but persistent. The ability to organize resistance, to respond not just to individual raids but to the broader pattern, marked a turning point. Fortifications improved. Armies became more structured. Systems of defense extended beyond single locations, creating networks that could respond more effectively. The Vikings, who had relied on speed and surprise, began to encounter something different. Preparedness. The easy victories of earlier years became less frequent. Raids still occurred, still brought success, but the balance had shifted. Targets were harder to exploit. Responses were faster. The cost of each campaign increased. And cost matters, because expansion depends on efficiency. When the risk outweighs the reward, the system begins to strain. At the same time, internal changes within the Viking world began to take shape. The very success of earlier expansions had created new realities. Settlements in England in the east, across the North Atlantic, these were no longer temporary outposts. They were communities, with needs, with structures, with priorities that extended beyond raiding. Leaders who had once focused solely on expansion now had to consider stability, maintaining control over land, managing resources, ensuring that settlements remained functional. All of this required attention. And attention is finite. The focus that had once driven outward expansion began to divide. Some continued to push. Others consolidated. The unified direction that had characterized earlier phases became more fragmented. At the same time, the cultural landscape was shifting. Christianity, already established in many of the regions the Vikings had entered, began to exert influence, not just as a belief system but as a framework of organization, of governance, of identity. For some Vikings, conversion was a strategic choice, a way to integrate, to gain acceptance, to stabilize control over lands that were already Christian. For others, it was a genuine shift in belief, a redefinition of worldview. But regardless of motivation, the effect was the same. Change. The old gods did not disappear overnight, but their influence began to wane. Gradually, as new structures replaced old ones, as new ideas took root, as the cultural identity of the Vikings began to evolve into something else, something less distinct, less separate. This process was not uniform. It varied by region, by leader, by circumstance. But it was happening, and it mattered, because identity is a powerful driver of action. And when identity changes, so do priorities. Meanwhile, in the broader European context, kingdoms were becoming more organized, more centralized, more capable of sustained response. The fragmented landscape that had once been so vulnerable to Viking tactics was consolidating. This did not eliminate conflict, but it changed its nature. The Vikings were no longer facing isolated targets. They were facing systems. Systems that could absorb impact, recover, respond. Systems that could learn. And learning opponents are dangerous. The technological advantage of the longship, while still significant, was no longer as decisive as it had once been. Defenses had adapted to account for river-based attacks. Coastal watch systems improved. Communication between regions became more effective. Surprise, once the defining element of Viking success, became harder to achieve. And without surprise, the balance shifts. The Vikings could still fight, still win. But the ease, the efficiency, the momentum began to fade. There were still moments of success. Still leaders who pushed forward, who achieved victories that echoed the earlier age. But they were no longer the norm. They were exceptions. The broader trend was moving in a different direction, toward stabilization, toward integration, toward an end to the kind of expansion that had defined the Viking Age. In England, this process became particularly clear. The Danelaw, once a stronghold of Viking influence, began to be challenged more effectively. Territories were contested, reclaimed, reorganized. The balance of power shifted gradually but consistently, not through a single decisive victory, but through sustained effort, through persistence, through adaptation. The same qualities that had once driven Viking success, now driving their opponents. In Scandinavia itself, the internal structure continued to evolve. The rise of more centralized kingdoms changed the dynamics of power. Leaders who had once operated as independent chieftains now found themselves within larger systems of authority. Kingship became more formalized, more structured. This reduced the kind of independent action that had fueled early raids. Because large-scale expansion requires a certain level of decentralization, of freedom, and as systems become more centralized, that freedom diminishes. The motivations that had once driven individuals to take to the sea began to change. Opportunities at home increased. Stability became more attainable. The need to risk everything for uncertain gain decreased. Not entirely, but enough to shift the balance. The Viking Age had thrived on a specific set of conditions: scarcity at home, opportunity abroad, fragmentation among targets, technological advantage, cultural drive. As those conditions changed, so did the outcome. The beginning of the end was not dramatic. It was gradual, a series of adjustments, adaptations, shifts that accumulated over time, until the system that had once driven expansion no longer functioned in the same way. This does not mean that the Vikings disappeared. Far from it. They remained, as settlers, as rulers, as part of the societies they had once attacked. But the identity of the Viking as a raider, as a force of sudden and unpredictable violence, began to fade, replaced by something else, something more integrated, more stable, more aligned with the structures of the regions they inhabited. The stories, however, did not fade. They persisted, carried forward, shaped by memory, by narrative, by the desire to remember a time when the world felt open, when the horizon promised opportunity, when the actions of individuals could reshape entire regions. But reality had changed. The conditions that made those stories possible were no longer present. And so the age moved toward its conclusion. Not with a final battle, not with a single defining moment, but with a shift, a transition, from expansion to consolidation, from disruption to integration, from the fury of the longships to the stability of kingdoms. The beginning of the end is often difficult to recognize in the moment. It does not announce itself. It does not declare that what has been will no longer continue. It simply happens, gradually, inevitably, until one day, looking back, it becomes clear that something has changed, that an age has passed, and that what remains is not the same as what came before. The Viking Age was not over, but it was no longer what it had been, and that difference would define everything that followed. Chapter 14. The Last Great Viking King. Ages do not end quietly. Even as the conditions that once fueled them begin to fade, there are always those who refuse to accept the shift, those who look at a changing world and see not inevitability, but challenge. Men who believe that what once was can still be. And among them, one name stands at the edge of the Viking Age. a final echo of its power, a last surge of its ambition. Harold Hardrada. His life did not begin at the end. It began in the heart of conflict. Born into a world already shaped by the forces of expansion and consolidation, Harold came of age in Norway during a time when power was becoming more centralized. Kings were no longer just leaders of raids, but rulers of territories, builders of kingdoms. But Harold was not content with stability. He was drawn to something more. War, opportunity, the chance to prove himself in a way that could not be achieved within the confines of a settled life. At a young age, he found himself on the losing side of a battle that would shape his future. Forced into exile, he did not retreat into obscurity. He moved east, following a path that many before him had taken, but few would walk as far. Into the world of the ruse and beyond. Eventually, he reached Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. A city unlike anything in the north, vast, wealthy, structured with a level of complexity that few in Scandinavia had ever encountered. Its walls were not just defensive structures, they were statements of power. And within those walls, Harold found his place. The Varangian Guard, elite warriors drawn from the north, serving as protectors of the emperor. It was here that Harold's legend began to take shape, not as a raider, but as a soldier within one of the most powerful empires of the time. He fought in campaigns across distant lands, faced enemies unlike those of the north, learned new forms of warfare, new strategies, new systems, and with each battle, each campaign, he gained something more than experience. He gained perspective. He saw what organized power looked like on a grand scale. He witnessed the strength of structured governance, of coordinated military force, of wealth concentrated and managed in ways that went far beyond the scattered systems of his homeland. And he accumulated wealth, significant wealth, because service in the Varangian Guard was not just about honor. It was about reward. Gold, silver, resources that, when brought back to Scandinavia, could transform a man's position entirely. But Harold was not content to remain. Eventually he left, returning north, carrying with him not just wealth, but ambition shaped by everything he had seen. He did not return as the man who had left. He returned as something else. A leader, a contender. In Norway he moved quickly. Power was not given. It was taken. Through alliances, through conflict, through strategic positioning, Harold established himself as king, not just in name but in authority. He worked to consolidate control, to bring stability to a region that had long been defined by fragmentation. But even as he secured his position, his gaze did not remain fixed on Norway. It turned outward, because Harold believed in something. That the Viking spirit, the drive to expand, to conquer, to assert dominance beyond one's own borders, was not over. That it could still be realized. And his target was England, the land that had once borne the full force of Viking expansion, the land where the great heathen army had reshaped kingdoms, where settlements had taken root, where influence had been established. But now England was different, more unified, more organized, more resistant. And yet Harold saw opportunity, a claim, a reason to act. Whether justified or not, it provided the foundation for what would become one of the final great campaigns of the Viking Age. In 1066, Harold gathered his forces, ships, warriors, a fleet that echoed the earlier days of expansion. Not as large as the great heathen army, but significant enough to represent a serious threat. He sailed west, toward a land that was no longer the same as it had been. The campaign began with success. Initial victories, battles that demonstrated that Harold's skill, his experience, his leadership were formidable. He was not an outdated relic of a fading age. He was a capable commander, a dangerous opponent. But early success does not guarantee final victory, because the world he was facing had changed. England, under new leadership, responded with speed, with coordination, with a level of organization that reflected the lessons learned over generations of conflict. The decisive moment came at Stamford Bridge, a battle that would define not just Harold's campaign, but the end of an era. The conditions were not in his favor. His forces, confident from earlier success, were not fully prepared for the speed of the response they faced. The English army moved quickly, catching the Viking forces at a moment of vulnerability. The battle was intense, brutal, close. For a time, it could have gone either way. But momentum shifted, and once it did not return. Harold fought, as expected, at the front, leading, not retreating, not yielding, because that was not who he was. And in that fight he fell, killed in battle, not in retreat, not in surrender, but in the way that the old stories would have demanded, facing the enemy, weapon in hand. His death marked more than the end of a campaign. It marked a turning point, a moment that, in hindsight, stands as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. Because what followed was different. Just weeks after Stamford Bridge, another invasion would take place. Not by Vikings, but by Normans, descendants of Vikings, shaped by generations of integration, now part of a different system, a different identity. The world had changed. The nature of expansion had changed. The structures of power had evolved. Harold's campaign, in many ways, was a final attempt to assert the old model. Direct, forceful, driven by individual ambition. But it collided with a world that had moved beyond that model. A world of organized kingdoms, of structured responses, of systems that could absorb and repel such attempts more effectively than before. Harold Hardrada is remembered not just for his actions, but for what he represents. The last great Viking king, a figure who embodied the qualities that had defined the age. Ambition, courage, adaptability, a willingness to push beyond limits, but also a reminder that no matter how powerful an individual may be, no matter how strong the drive to continue what has been, time moves forward. Conditions change, and even the most formidable leaders must face the reality of that change. His life, spanning from exile to empire, from service in distant lands to kingship at home, reflects the full arc of the Viking experience. Movement, adaptation, expansion, and finally, confrontation with a world that no longer operated under the same rules. The ships that carried Harold to England were not just vessels of war. They were echoes of a time when the horizon promised opportunity, when the seas were pathways to power, when the actions of a single leader could reshape the fate of regions. But at Stamford Bridge, those echoes met their limit. And beyond that limit lay a different future. One where the Viking identity would not disappear, but would transform into something new, something integrated, something that would carry forward elements of the past, but within a structure that no longer allowed for the same kind of expansion. Harold Hardrada did not end the Viking Age alone, but his death marks the moment when it became clear that the age had reached its final chapter, that what had once defined an era could not continue unchanged, and that even the greatest among them could not hold back the tide of history. The last great Viking king had fallen, and with him, the old world faded into memory. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the Vikings. The ships are gone. The sails that once cut across cold northern seas, carrying warriors, traders, explorers, have faded into memory. The sound of oars striking water in perfect rhythm, the sight of longships appearing on distant horizons, no longer defines the world. The Viking Age has ended. But endings are rarely what they seem, because what disappears in form often remains in influence. And the legacy of the Vikings did not vanish with their last great king. It remained, embedded, woven into the very fabric of the world they had once shaken. At first, the change is difficult to see. The transition from Viking to something else does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds gradually, as identities shift, as cultures blend, as the sharp edges of the past soften into something more stable. The warriors become rulers. The raiders become settlers. The outsiders become part of the system. In England, this transformation is unmistakable. The lands once defined by conflict between Viking and Anglo-Saxon now move toward unity. The influence of the Danelaw does not disappear, it integrates. Laws, customs, language, all carry traces of the North. Words remain. Names remain. Structures remain, even as the identity changes. The descendants of Vikings no longer see themselves as invaders. They are part of the land. Their stories, once tied to distant homelands, now rooted in the soil they inhabit. And over time, the distinction fades. But it does not vanish, because influence does not require visibility. It persists in subtle ways, in the way people speak, in the way communities are organized, in the way trade flows across regions. The Viking impact was not just destruction, it was connection. They had opened routes, established networks, linked distant parts of the world in ways that had not existed before. Even after the age of raids ended, those connections remained. Expanded, refined, built upon. In the East, the legacy takes a different form. The Rus, once Viking traders and rulers along the great rivers, had already begun to transform into something new. Their identity merged with the cultures around them, contributing to the formation of states that would endure long after the Viking name had faded. The structures they helped create did not collapse. They evolved. Because once a system is established, it rarely disappears entirely. It changes, adapts, becomes something else. In Normandy, another transformation had already taken place. Descendants of Vikings settled in a foreign land had adopted new language, new customs, new systems of governance. They were no longer seen as outsiders. They were rulers. And in 1066, the same year that marked the fall of Harald Hardrada, these descendants would cross the sea once again, not as Vikings, but as something new. Organized, structured, part of a different kind of expansion. The conquest of England by the Normans was not a Viking raid, but it carried the echo of that past. The same willingness to cross the sea, the same ambition to claim land, the same understanding that power could be taken if one was willing to risk everything. The form had changed. The spirit had not entirely disappeared. Back in Scandinavia, the transformation was equally profound. The old structures of scattered chieftains and raiding bands gave way to more centralized kingdoms. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, each moved towards systems that resembled the rest of Europe. Christianity took root. The old gods, once central to identity, began to fade into story. Odin, Thor, Loki, no longer figures of worship but figures of memory. Their influence did not vanish, but it changed form. from belief to myth, from practice to narrative. And in that shift, something important happened. The Viking Age became history. Not a living reality, but a remembered one. Told through stories, through sagas, through fragments of the past preserved in words and objects. But memory is powerful. It shapes identity, even when the original context is gone. The idea of the Viking did not disappear. It evolved, sometimes romanticized, sometimes misunderstood, but always present in some form. A symbol of exploration, of resilience, of a willingness to face the unknown. Because beyond the violence, beyond the raids and battles, there was something else at the core of the Viking story. Movement, the refusal to remain confined, the drive to push beyond what is known. That drive did not end with the Viking Age. It continued in different forms. In exploration, in expansion, in the way humans continue to look at the horizon and wonder what lies beyond. The technological legacy, too, remains. The longship, a design so advanced for its time, influenced shipbuilding in ways that extended far beyond the Viking world. Its balance of speed, flexibility, and strength demonstrated what was possible when necessity met innovation. It was more than a tool. It was a statement that limitations could be overcome, that environments could be adapted to, that the sea, often seen as a barrier, could become a pathway. And that idea endures. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the depth of Viking influence. Burial sites, tools, structures, each offering insight into a world that was once alive, once dynamic, once in motion. These are not just remnants. They are evidence, proof of a culture that shaped history in ways that are still being understood. But perhaps the most significant legacy is not physical. It is conceptual. The Vikings challenged the idea of boundaries. Geographical, cultural, political. They demonstrated that distance could be crossed, that systems could be disrupted, that new possibilities could be created through action. They were not the first to do so, but they did it in a way that forced the world to respond, to adapt, to change. And that response reshaped history. The kingdoms of Europe became stronger, more organized, in part because they had to be. The interactions between cultures increased, trade networks expanded, ideas moved more freely. The Viking Age, in its intensity, accelerated processes that might otherwise have taken much longer. It forced movement, and movement creates change. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the extremes. The raids, the battles, the dramatic moments that define the narrative. But the true legacy lies in the accumulation of impact, in the gradual changes that followed, in the ways the world became more connected, more dynamic, more complex. Because of what the Vikings did. The end of the Viking Age is not a disappearance. It is a transition. From action to memory, from presence to influence, from identity to legacy. And that legacy continues, not in the form of longships appearing on the horizon, but in the structures of societies, in the flow of history, in the stories that are still told. Stories of men and women who lived in a harsh world and refused to be limited by it, who looked beyond their shores and acted, who faced uncertainty and moved forward anyway. The Vikings are no longer here, but what they set in motion still is. In the end, that is what defines an age. Not how it ends, but what it leaves behind. And the Viking Age left behind a world that would never be the same again.